The Mafia boss Daniel Sheehan had everything a man could ever dream of. Money. Power. An empire that made the entire city bow before him. But there was one thing he could not buy: a peaceful night's sleep. For 5 years, Daniel had lived like a dead man inside his own luxurious mansion. He could not sleep, could barely eat, and his health was deteriorating because of an illness that even countless doctors could not fully explain. He had hired 99 of the best chefs in the world. Chefs who had cooked for the elite famous chefs whose dishes cost thousands of dollars. But he fired every single one of them, until one day, a plump young woman pregnant and abandoned by her fiancé on her own wedding day walked into that mansion simply to ask for a job. She had no money, no status, no man standing by her side. The only thing she had were the hands that had once cooked simple meals for her sick mother, and a heart that had grown far too accustomed to being looked down upon by others. And yet, after just one meal she cooked, Daniel finished the entire plate for the first time in days. That night, something even more unbelievable happened. The man who had suffered from insomnia for 5 years closed his eyes and slept peacefully until morning for the first time. But Daniel had no idea that the woman standing before him was not a stranger. She was the daughter of the man who had died years ago while protecting his parents. And when the truth was finally revealed, Daniel broke down in tears and said something that left her completely stunned. "Nora, stop being my housekeeper. Become my wife." But why would a man who could have any woman he wanted choose a girl who had once been abandoned by the very man she loved? And could Nora forgive him after learning that her father died because of a mistake Daniel had carried in his heart for 5 years? This is not merely a story about a woman who healed a broken man with simple homemade meals. It is the story of two people who had both lost everything, only to meet by fate and save each other's lives. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. The kitchen lights were still burning at midnight when the whispers began. "He fired another one today," said a voice low and mocking, drifting from behind the pantry door. 99 chefs. 99. You'd think a man with that much money could at least learn to swallow a plate of eggs without making a scene. A second voice snickered. "Money can't fix broken Carl. That man up there is rotting from the inside. All that gold, all those cars, and he can't even sleep like a normal person. Pathetic, if you ask me. A grown man scared of his own bed." Daniel Sheehan stood frozen in the hallway outside the kitchen door, one hand resting against the cold marble wall, his shadow long and still beneath the chandelier light. He had not meant to hear it. He had only come downstairs as he did most nights because sleep would not come and the silence of his room had grown unbearable. But the words reached him anyway, sharp as broken glass, and something in his chest tightened old and familiar, the way it always did whenever someone mistook his silence for weakness or his exhaustion for softness. He did not storm in. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned quietly and walked back toward the staircase, his jaw set, his eyes distant. Men who ran empires learned sooner or later that the deepest wounds were the ones nobody ever saw land. The Sheehan estate sat on the edge of Phoenix like a fortress built out of glass and gold, its windows glowing gently against the desert night, its gardens manicured to a precision that looked almost unnatural under the moonlight. From the outside, it was the kind of house people slowed their cars to stare at. From the inside, it was the loneliest place in the state. Daniel climbed the stairs slowly, his footsteps echoing off the polished floors, and returned to his bedroom, a vast space of pale stone and soft lighting that had cost more than most people's homes and had never once felt warm. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall the way he had stared at that same wall nearly every night for 5 long years. He checked the clock, 12:30 in the morning, right on schedule. His eyes would not close. They rarely did anymore, not really, not the way sleep was supposed to work, deep and forgetful and kind. Instead, his mind circled the same old paths, the same old ghosts, until exhaustion became just another kind of waking. Daniel Sheehan was 34 years old. He controlled a real estate and construction empire that stretched across 3 states, employed thousands of people who never asked too many questions about where the real money came from, and could, if he wanted, to buy nearly anything in the city of Phoenix twice over. And still on most nights he lay in the dark like a man drowning in plain sight, hungry for something no amount of money had ever been able to purchase: rest. It had not always been this way. There had been a time long before the gold and the glass and the men who called him boss with their eyes lowered, when Daniel Sheehan had known a different kind of hunger, the kind that lived in the stomach and not the soul. He remembered it more clearly than he remembered most of his adult life, the way a person remembers pain more vividly than comfort. He remembered the trailer on the outskirts of a small Ohio town, its metal walls groaning against the wind and the winters, when the heater broke and never got fixed because there was no money to fix it. He remembered lying awake as a boy, not from any illness of the mind back then, but from the simple, brutal cold that crept in through the cracks in the walls, wrapping a threadbare blanket tighter around his shoulders and counting the hours, until morning. He remembered his stomach aching with a hunger that never quite left, the kind that made a boy stare too long at other children's lunch trays, the kind that taught him early to swallow his pride along with his pain. His father had worked 3 jobs and still could not keep the lights on some months. His mother had sewn patches onto patches until the clothes were more thread than fabric. Daniel had learned to work before he had learned much else. First sweeping floors at a mechanic's garage for a few dollars a week, then hauling lumber on construction sites twice his size, his hands blistering his back, aching, his young mind already calculating, always calculating how far each dollar could stretch. There had been nights he had gone to bed with nothing in his stomach but water. Nights he had watched his mother pretend she wasn't hungry, so there would be more food for him. Nights he had promised himself fiercely, silently, that one day none of them would ever have to feel that kind of desperate, grinding poverty again. He had kept that promise. He had built an empire from nothing but grit and desperation and a refusal to lose. But somewhere along the way in the climb from nothing to everything, he had lost something too, something quieter, something he had never quite been able to name. Perhaps it was the ability to trust the stillness of his own mind. Perhaps it was simply peace. The doctors had their theories. Stress, anxiety, a body that had spent too many years in survival mode and had forgotten how to stand down even now that the danger, the real danger, was supposedly behind him. His personal physician, an older man named Dr. Whitfield, who had treated him for years, had run every test twice, prescribed sleeping pills that left Daniel groggy and hollow, and finally quietly admitted that some things could not be measured on a chart. "Your body doesn't believe it's safe, Daniel," the doctor had told him once, adjusting his glasses with a tired sigh. "You can own every building in this city, and your body still won't believe the danger has passed." Daniel had said nothing to that. What was there to say that some nights he still heard his father's coughing through the trailer walls, that some nights he still felt the cold, that the danger had never really passed it, had only changed shape, following him from poverty into power, waiting patiently in the dark corners of every room he ever tried to rest in? He rose from the bed and walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling lights of Phoenix. Thousands of people sleeping peacefully in homes far smaller than his own. He wondered not for the first time what that must feel like. A soft knock came at the door. Daniel. The voice belonged to Peggy Doyle, his longtime housekeeper, the closest thing to family he had left in this world. She stepped inside without waiting for an answer, the way she had done since he was young enough to still need someone to tuck him in. Her eyes moved over him with the particular sharpness of a woman who had raised children and buried a husband, and had long ago stopped pretending not to notice pain when she saw it. "You heard them, didn't you?" she said quietly. It was not a question. Daniel did not turn from the window. "Doesn't matter. It matters." Peggy crossed the room and stood beside him, her voice gentling. "You didn't build all this to be spoken to that way in your own house. They're not wrong, Peggy." His voice, when it finally came, was low, almost hesitant, stripped of the hard authority he wore like armor during daylight hours. "What good is any of it if I can't even sleep through a single night?" Peggy studied him for a long moment, the way she had studied him as a boy who had shown up on her sister's doorstep years ago, thin and guarded and far too old for his age. "You need peace, Daniel, not medicine. If peace were for sale," he murmured, almost smiling despite himself, "I'd have bought the whole company that made it." She let out a soft, tired laugh, patting his arm gently. "Some things were never meant to be bought, son. I'm going to see an old friend of mine for a few days. She's not been well." Daniel frowned slightly. "Now, you want to leave now. I'll be back before you know it." Peggy's eyes carried a strange quiet, knowing the kind of look she got sometimes when she believed something Daniel did not yet understand. "And who knows," she added softly, heading for the door, "maybe I'll bring something back with me, something better than sleep." He almost scoffed the old habit of guarding his hope rising fast and automatic. "Unless you're bringing sleep in your suitcase, I'm not interested." Peggy only smiled the kind of smile that held a secret and disappeared down the hallway, leaving Daniel alone again, with the silence, the ache in his chest, and the slow, familiar dread of another sleepless night stretching out before him like a road with no end. He had no way of knowing, standing there in the cold blue light of the window, that somewhere far away in a small town he had never heard of, a woman was about to walk into his life and undo everything he thought he understood about strength, about wealth, and about the quiet, desperate hunger of a heart that had forgotten how to hope. The house grew quieter after Peggy's car pulled away down the long gravel drive, its taillights disappearing into the dark like two dying embers. Daniel stood at the window long after the sound of the engine had faded, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, the silence did not feel peaceful. It felt like an invitation, the kind he had spent years trying to avoid, into a room in his mind he kept locked most nights out of sheer necessity. He turned from the glass, walked to the study across the hall, and sat down behind the heavy oak desk that had once belonged to his father, the one true object he had refused to sell or replace even after the money came flooding in. His fingers moved almost without his permission to the bottom drawer, the one that stuck slightly when the desert air grew dry, and pulled out a small wooden box, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. Inside lay a single photograph cracked along one corner, and an old flip phone that no longer held a charge, its screen dark and silent exactly the way it had been for years. Daniel stared at it the way a man stares at a wound he has never let heal properly, one that scars over and reopens over and over whenever the world grows quiet enough for him to hear his own thoughts. He had been 28 years old the night everything changed. Not a boy anymore, but not yet. The man he would become, either still caught somewhere in the space between ambition and grief, between the poverty he had clawed his way out of and the empire he had only just begun to build. His parents, Robert and Margaret Sheehan, had spent their whole lives working first in factories, then in their later years watching with quiet disbelief as their son turned a single struggling construction crew into something larger than either of them had ever dared to imagine. They had never fully understood the darker corners of what that empire required to survive in a city like Phoenix, the alliances, the debts, the men who smiled at dinner and threatened ruin behind closed doors. Daniel had shielded them from all of it, or believed he had, right up until the night it no longer mattered whether they understood or not. It had been raining that night, a rare desert storm that turned the streets slick and dark headlights smearing across wet asphalt like ghosts. His parents had been driving home from a dinner Daniel himself had arranged, a small sentimental gesture, a thank you for years of sacrifice he had never properly repaid. He remembered feeling almost light that evening, almost hopeful, the way a man feels when he believes foolishly that the worst of his struggles are finally behind him. His phone had rung twice that night. He remembered it now, the way a person remembers the exact shape of a falling object, slow and terrible and impossible to stop. The first call had come from a business partner, some minor contract dispute that Daniel, exhausted and eager to enjoy a rare, quiet evening, had let go to voicemail. The second call had come from Frank Quinn. Frank had been more than an employee. He had been the family's driver for nearly a decade by then, a steady, soft-spoken man, with a laugh that filled a room and a loyalty that never once wavered. Not through the lean years, not through the dangerous ones either. He had driven Daniel's parents to countless dinners, countless doctor's appointments, countless ordinary evenings that had never once felt like they might be their last. He had also, in the final months of his life, quietly begun noticing things that troubled him. Unfamiliar cars parked too long on quiet streets. Men who asked too many questions about the family's routines. A tension in the air that Daniel buried in spreadsheets and expansion plans had been too consumed to fully register. That night, Frank had called to warn him. Daniel had let it ring. He had been in the middle of finalizing a deal that would later mean nothing to him, absolutely nothing compared to what he lost in the hours that followed. By the time he finally noticed the missed call, sitting alone in his office with a glass of unfinished whiskey and the quiet satisfaction of a good day's work, it was already too late to matter. The ambush had happened less than 2 miles from the restaurant. Later, the official reports would call it a robbery gone wrong, a random act of violence on a rain-soaked street. Daniel had never believed that explanation, not for a single day since, though he had never managed to prove otherwise either. His parents had been killed instantly. Frank Quinn, who had thrown himself between the gunman and the car in the final desperate seconds of his life, had died beside them. A stranger's guardian angel that nobody in Daniel's family had ever properly thanked, not while he was alive, and never once since. Daniel had listened to that final voicemail exactly one time the night after the funeral, alone in this very study, and had never been able to bring himself to listen to it again. He knew roughly what it said. A warning, urgent and afraid, cut short by static and then silence. He did not need to hear Frank's voice a second time to understand what it meant. If he had answered, if he had simply answered the phone, the guilt had settled into him that night, and had never once in all the years since fully let go. The months that followed the funeral had tested him in ways poverty never had. Grief, it turned out, was a different kind of hunger entirely, one that could not be solved by working harder or earning more. His uncle, a man Daniel had once trusted, had appeared within weeks demanding a share of the company, insisting a grieving 28-year-old had no business running an empire built by better men. Cousins he barely remembered had suddenly found lawyers. Board members had begun making quiet calls to competitors, testing whether the throne might already be unsteady enough to topple. Daniel had not broken. He had done the only thing he knew how to do. The thing poverty had taught him better than anyone he had fought. Court battles, boardroom betrayals, sleepless nights spent poring over contracts by lamplight determined that his parents' life's work and Frank Quinn's final sacrifice would not be stolen out from under him by people who had never once gone hungry a day in their lives. He had won. Every single time he had won. But somewhere in the winning, something inside him had quietly, permanently closed. He had grown suspicious of kindness, wary of warmth, certain that anyone who drew close enough to matter would eventually either betray him or be taken from him the way his parents had been taken. The way Frank had been taken in the space of one ordinary rain-soaked night he had not been paying close enough attention to stop. He had built walls instead of bridges after that. He had learned to run an empire with a closed fist and a colder heart, trusting almost no one beyond the small, tightly guarded circle of Jimmy Conlon and Peggy Doyle, the only two people left alive who had known him before all the money, before all the power, back when he had simply been a hungry boy, trying to survive one more cold Ohio night. Daniel closed the wooden box slowly, his hands steady out of long practice, though something behind his ribs remained anything but calm. He returned it to the drawer, pushed it shut, and sat back in the chair. His father had once sat in decades before him, staring at nothing the way he so often did in these late, unguarded hours. Somewhere outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling softly against the windows, carrying with it the distant, restless promise of a storm still gathering strength on the horizon. Daniel Sheehan did not know it yet, sitting alone in the quiet dark of his father's old study. But that storm, in more ways than one, was already on its way toward him. And it would not be stopped by locked drawers or guarded hearts or any fortune a man could build with his own two hands. Some debts, it seemed, always came due eventually, and some doors, no matter how carefully a man kept them locked, were destined to be opened by someone he had not yet even met. The town did not believe in gentle mornings. Frost still clung to the fence posts along the narrow road when Nora Quinn stepped out of the small clapboard house, her breath fogging in the cold Ohio air, a threadbare coat pulled tight across a body that had grown thinner than it should have been for a woman carrying new life inside her. She walked quickly the way she had learned to walk over the past several months, head down, arms wrapped around herself, as though moving fast enough might outrun the stares that had followed her through town since the wedding that never was. She had not slept properly in longer than she could remember. Between the double shifts at the diner on Main Street, the hours spent caring for her mother, whose cough had grown worse with the changing season, and the ache that lived permanently now behind her ribs, sleep had become something Nora simply did not have time for anymore. Some nights she lay awake on the narrow cot in the back room, listening to the wind rattle the thin windows, her stomach hollow with a hunger she had grown almost too tired to notice, wondering how a life could unravel so completely in the space of a single afternoon. She could still see it if she closed her eyes. The little white chapel on the edge of town, decorated with borrowed flowers because there had been no money for real ones. Her dress secondhand, taken in twice by her own careful hand because nothing off the rack had ever quite fit a body like hers. The whole town gathered in those creaking wooden pews, watching, waiting the way small towns always watched and waited for something to talk about. And then Wade Colton, the man she had loved since high school, the man she had believed would stand beside her at that altar for the rest of her life, had turned to her in front of everyone with a look on his face she had never seen before, cold and cruel, and utterly without mercy. "I can't do this," he had said loud enough for the whole chapel to hear. "I can't marry someone who let herself go like this. And now you expect me to raise a baby with a woman who looks like this?" The silence that followed had been the worst part, worse even than the words themselves. Nobody had defended her. A few people had laughed quietly, cruelly behind gloved hands. Someone near the back had actually applauded, as though Wade's cruelty had been some kind of performance deserving of praise. Nora had stood there in her second-hand dress, one hand pressed instinctively over the small curve of her stomach, feeling the whole world tilt sideways beneath her, dizzy, disoriented, her ears ringing with a horror so complete It had left her unable to speak, unable to cry, unable to do anything but stand frozen at the altar, while the man she loved walked away and did not look back. She had walked home alone that day, still in her wedding dress, past storefronts and porches where people paused what they were doing simply to watch her pass, and had not said a single word to anyone until she reached her own front door and finally collapsed into her mother's arms, shaking numb, hollowed out in a way she was not sure she would ever fully recover from. That had been months ago. The town had not let her forget it since. There she goes again, a voice murmured from the porch of the general store, as Nora passed that morning, not bothering to lower itself much. Wonder how she's going to feed that baby looking the way she does. Can barely feed herself. Nora did not turn her head. She had learned slowly and painfully how to keep walking through words like that. How to let them land somewhere deep and quiet inside her without letting them show on her face. It cost her something every single time. A little more of whatever strength she had left, but she had a mother to care for and a child coming and no room left in her life for the luxury of falling apart in public more than once. She reached the small house at the edge of town just as the morning light was beginning to warm the frost on the windows, and pushed open the door to find her mother, Ruth Quinn, sitting up in bed, pale and thin but smiling the moment she saw her daughter. "There's my girl, Ruth," said softly, her voice carrying the particular rasp of a cough that had lingered far longer than either of them wanted to admit. "You look tired, sweetheart." "I'm fine, Mama." Nora crossed the room and pressed a kiss to her mother's forehead, the lie coming easily now the way it always did. Just a long shift. Ruth studied her daughter's face for a long moment, the way mothers do when they see straight through comfortable lies, and said nothing more about it, choosing instead to reach for her daughter's hand and simply hold it the way she had held it through every hard season of Nora's life. So far, it was into this quiet, aching morning that the knock came at the door. Peggy Doyle had not seen Ruth Quinn in nearly 2 years, not since life and distance and the demands of the Sheehan estate had pulled her further and further from the small Ohio town where she herself had been raised. But some friendships did not fade simply because the miles grew longer, and the moment word had reached her that Ruth had taken ill. Peggy had packed a bag and driven through the night without a second thought. She stepped through the door and crossed the small, worn living room in 3 quick strides, gathering Ruth into a careful embrace. "What is this nonsense?" Peggy said, half laughing, half scolding, "lying around like you've given up on me already." "Wouldn't dream of it," Ruth said, weakly laughing despite the cough that followed. "Just getting old, Peggy. That's all." It was then that Nora entered from the kitchen, a nylon bag of groceries in one hand, and stopped short at the sight of the familiar face. "Peggy Doyle." She breathed, setting the bag down and crossing the room in a rush, wrapping the older woman in a hug fierce enough to nearly knock them both off balance. "You look like the city's been treating you well. And you," Peggy said, pulling back to study her, "look like you've been carrying the whole world on your shoulders, child." Nora waved a hand, forcing a bright smile onto a face that had grown far too practiced at hiding exhaustion. "I'm managing. Somebody's got to keep this house standing." Peggy's sharp eyes did not miss the shadows beneath the girl's eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly with fatigue, the careful way she moved as though bracing herself against a world that had not been kind to her in a very long time. But she said nothing about it just yet, settling instead into the chair beside Ruth's bed and letting the conversation drift gently toward easier things. It was later that evening, after Ruth had drifted into an exhausted sleep, and the two women sat together at the small kitchen table over cups of weak coffee, that Peggy finally spoke the question that had been forming in her mind since she'd first stepped through the door. "Nora," she said carefully, "how would you feel about coming to Phoenix?" Nora blinked, caught entirely off guard. "Phoenix, Peggy, I can't just leave Mama. I'm not asking you to abandon her." Peggy reached across the table and covered the younger woman's hand with her own. "I'm asking you to let me help you. There's good work out there. Real work with real pay. Enough to send money home, enough to give that mother of yours proper care. And enough eventually to bring her out there with you if that's what you both want." Nora sat very still for a long moment, her mind spinning through exhaustion and disbelief in equal measure. The fear of the unfamiliar warring against the desperate, aching hope that maybe finally something in her life might actually change, for the better. What kind of work? Housekeeping? Cooking? "In a large estate belonging to a very wealthy family I work for." Nora let out a short, tired laugh, one hand drifting instinctively to rest over the small curve of her stomach. "Peggy, look at me. I'm exhausted, I'm heartbroken, I'm carrying a baby with no father in sight, and half this town won't even look me in the eye anymore. You really think some rich family wants someone like me in their house?" "I think," Peggy said quietly, her voice firm and warm all at once, "that you've got more strength in you than you know, and more heart than most people twice your size. That's exactly what that house needs. Nora looked down at her hands, worn and calloused from years of hard, honest work, and felt something long buried stir quietly back to life inside her chest. It was not quite hope, not yet. Not after everything the world had already taken from her. But it was something close to it, small and fragile and trembling. The first flicker of light she had allowed herself to feel in longer than she could remember. "Let me think about it," she said softly. But even as the words left her mouth, some quiet, tired, wondering part of her already knew what her answer would be. The drive from Ohio to Arizona took the better part of 2 days, and by the time the old sedan finally crested the last hill and the Sheehan estate came into view, Nora Quinn had run out of words to describe what she was looking at. Wrought iron gates stretched taller than any building she had ever stood beside, opening onto a driveway lined with palm trees that seemed to have been trimmed by hand one by one, until each stood in perfect unnatural symmetry. Beyond them, the house itself rose like something out of a magazine she might have flipped through once in a waiting room. All pale stone and glass, glowing faintly gold in the late afternoon light. "Peggy," Nora said, slowly pressing her palm flat against the car window. "Is this a house or a hotel?" "This is where you'll be working, dear," Peggy said, though there was a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth as she watched the girl's face. Nora pressed a hand to her chest, half laughing, half genuinely dizzy at the sheer scale of it. "If I faint, please don't waste the good water reviving me. Use the tap stuff." Peggy laughed, but as the car rolled to a stop in the circular drive, the humor drained slowly from Nora's face, replaced by something tighter, more careful. She smoothed the front of her plain cotton dress, the only nice one she owned, and stepped out onto gravel so clean it looked as though it had never once been walked on before. The staff had gathered near the side entrance before Nora had even reached the door, arms crossed, eyes sharp, and assessing in the particular way of people who had spent years learning to size up newcomers within seconds. A tall woman near the front, sharp-featured and unsmiling, looked Nora over slowly, her gaze lingering deliberately on the soft curve of her stomach and the tired weight she carried in her frame. "Well," the woman said, not bothering to lower her voice, "guess Mr. Sheehan's standards have really dropped." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the small group. Nora felt the words land somewhere low in her chest. Familiar in the way old bruises are familiar. But she kept her spine straight and her chin level the way she had taught herself to do back home, in a town that had never once let her forget her own supposed failures. "Careful," Nora said, her voice pleasant, almost sweet, though there was steel running quietly beneath it. "Standards have a funny way of surprising people." The woman's smile faltered just slightly before Peggy stepped smoothly between them, her tone brisk and final. "That's enough. Nora's with me. Show some manners, all of you, or answer to me instead." The group dispersed with a few muttered comments and several lingering, unfriendly glances, and Nora exhaled slowly, feeling her heartbeat settle by degrees, as Peggy led her through a side entrance and into a hallway so grand it seemed to swallow the sound of their footsteps whole. They found Daniel Sheehan in his study, seated behind the heavy oak desk, a stack of contracts spread in front of him, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, his expression unreadable. He did not look up immediately when the two women entered, and for a long, strange moment, Nora simply stood in the doorway, taking in the sight of him, the quiet, contained power that seemed to radiate off him even while he sat perfectly still. "This is the young woman I told you about," Peggy said gently. "Nora Quinn." Daniel's eyes lifted slowly, moving over Nora with a cool, assessing gaze that reminded her uncomfortably of the wedding guests who had watched her walk home alone in her dress. His voice, when it came, was flat and unimpressed. "You're pregnant," he said. It was not a question. Nora's chin lifted a fraction of an inch. "Last I checked, yes, sir. And no husband from what Peggy tells me." He set down his pen with deliberate slowness, leaning back in his chair, studying her the way a man studies a contract he already half suspects is a bad deal. "Forgive me if I don't see the appeal in bringing that kind of complication into my household." The words landed harder than the ones from the staff outside had. Nora felt her face flush, humiliation and fury, tangling together low in her stomach. But she had spent months now, absorbing exactly this kind of cruelty, and something in her, some last stubborn ember of dignity, refused to let it break her in front of him. "With respect, sir," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly at her sides, "I didn't come here for your approval of my life choices. I came here because I know how to work hard, and I'm not afraid of hard work no matter how it looks from the outside." She took a small step forward, meeting his gaze, directly refusing to look away. "I've already lost everything a person can lose in this life. Lost the man I loved, lost my dignity in front of half my town, lost the wedding I saved 2 years to pay for. So no, sir, you standing there in your fine suit passing judgment on me doesn't scare me one bit. There's nothing left for you to take." For a long moment, silence filled the study, thick and charged. Daniel's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes flickered a brief, involuntary flash of surprise, as though he had expected her to wilt, and instead found himself facing something far sturdier than he'd anticipated. "Bold words," he said finally, quietly, for someone asking me for a job. "I'm not asking, sir." Nora held his gaze, her voice softening only slightly. "I'm offering. There's a difference." It was Jimmy Conlon standing near the window with his arms crossed who broke the silence with a low, humorless laugh. "She's got nerve, I'll give her that." He pushed off the wall and studied Nora with open suspicion. "But nerve's cheap, sweetheart. Anybody can walk in here with a sad story and a big mouth." Jimmy Daniel said, a warning edge creeping into his tone. "I'm just saying what needs saying." Jimmy's eyes did not leave Nora's face. "We've had 99 of the finest chefs in this country walk through those doors, and every single one of them turned out to be exactly what they claimed to be, and it still went sideways on us. Forgive me if I'm not eager to trust the 100th stranger who shows up needing something from this family." The words hung strangely in the air, heavier than they should have been for a passing complaint about staffing troubles, and Nora caught the brief, tense look that passed between Daniel and Jimmy, something unspoken and careful moving between, to them like a shared wound, neither wanted named aloud in front of a stranger. "What happened with the chefs?" Nora asked before she could stop herself. "Nothing that concerns you," Daniel said quickly, too quickly, his jaw tightening. But Jimmy's gaze had already narrowed, further thoughtful now, instead of merely suspicious. "Every single one of them gone within weeks. Always some excuse, always some reason to be dismissed, before they'd been here long enough to really settle in." He looked at Daniel. "You ever stop to wonder if that was the point? Somebody wanted eyes in this house watching how sick you've really gotten, watching how bad the nights have gotten, feeding information to God knows who before we ever caught on." Daniel's face went carefully blank, the particular stillness of a man forcing himself not to react in front of an audience, but Nora, standing quietly in the doorway, saw the flicker of something darker pass behind his eyes, something that looked almost like fear. "That's enough, Jimmy," he said, finally, his voice low. Jimmy held up both hands in surrender, though his eyes remained sharp, calculating, still fixed on Nora with open wariness. "Just keep your eyes open, boss. That's all I'm saying. This house has had enough strangers with hidden reasons." The room fell into an uneasy silence, and Nora stood very still, feeling suddenly keenly aware of just how little she understood about the world she had walked into, how much danger and history seemed to live quietly beneath the surface of this beautiful, glittering house. She thought of her mother's cough, of the money she desperately needed to send home, of the child growing inside her who deserved a mother strong enough to provide for them both, and found somewhere deep beneath the fear a small, stubborn resolve settling into place. Whatever secrets lived in this house, whatever quiet war, Daniel Sheehan and his people seemed to be fighting behind closed doors. Nora had not traveled 2 days across the country to be frightened away by it now. "I understand you have your reasons to be careful, sir," she said quietly, addressing Daniel directly. "But I'm not here to hurt anyone or steal anything. I'm here to work and to earn an honest wage for honest labor. That's all I've ever asked of this world, and it's all I'm asking of you now." Daniel studied her for a long, silent moment, something unreadable moving behind his tired eyes, before he finally exhaled and looked away toward the window, toward the wide desert sky beginning to darken outside. "Peggy will show you to the staff quarters," he said quietly. "We'll see how the first week goes." It was not a warm welcome. It was not even quite a kind one, but it was. Nora realized as Peggy gently touched her shoulder and led her from the room exactly the chance she had come all this way praying for. And as she stepped back out into the wide, unfamiliar hallway, some small, cautious part of her allowed itself for the first time in a very long time to hope that perhaps this strange, guarded house might hold more for her than she had dared to imagine. The staff quarters were smaller than anything Nora had expected from a house so grand, plain rooms with narrow beds and thin curtains, but after months of sleeping fitfully on a cot in her mother's back room, the mattress felt almost sinfully soft beneath her. She lay awake that first night longer than she meant to, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, listening to the strange quiet of a house so large. It seemed to swallow sound whole, and thought about the man behind the study desk, the flash of something raw and guarded she had glimpsed behind his eyes before he'd looked away. She did not understand him yet. She was not sure, lying there in the dark, that she wanted to. Morning came early, the desert light pale and clean through the thin curtains, and Nora rose before most of the household, pulling on the plain apron Peggy had left folded at the foot of her bed. In the kitchen, the other staff members moved around her with the careful, practiced distance of people who had already decided collectively that she did not belong. "You're on breakfast prep," said a woman named Denise, not quite meeting Nora's eyes as she set a stack of ingredients on the counter. Mr. Sheehan doesn't eat much most mornings. Don't take it personal if it comes back untouched. Nora nodded, tying the apron behind her back, with hands that had grown steady again overnight, and got to work. She had grown up cooking. There had never been money in her family for anything fancy. No cookbooks with glossy photographs, no lessons from anyone but her own grandmother, who had taught her standing at a scorched old stove in a kitchen barely bigger than a closet, that the best food in the world came not from expensive ingredients, but from patience and care and love folded quietly into every single step. Nora cracked eggs into a bowl sliced bread thick for toast, and began frying strips of bacon in a pan, the smell rising warm and familiar, filling the sterile modern kitchen with something that felt for the first time since she'd arrived, almost like home. Upstairs, Daniel Sheehan sat at his desk with a stack of unread emails glowing on his laptop screen, his eyes burning with exhaustion, his mind circling the same tired loops it always did after another sleepless night. He had barely eaten in days. Food had become, over the past several months, less a comfort and more a chore, something his body demanded, and his mind had lost all interest in providing. A knock came at the door. "Come in," he said, not looking up. Nora entered carrying a tray, and Daniel glanced up briefly, expecting Denise or one of the other staff, and found himself instead facing the woman from the study the day before her. Chin lifted, her expression carefully neutral, though he did not miss the small defensive tension in her shoulders. "Your breakfast, sir," she said, setting the tray down on the corner of the desk. He looked at the plate without much interest. Eggs, toast, bacon, simple food, nothing like the elaborate dishes his previous chefs had spent hours perfecting. "I don't usually eat much in the mornings." "With respect," Sir Nora said, straightening, "you look like a man who hasn't eaten much of anything in a while." Daniel's eyes lifted sharply at that, a flicker of something between irritation and surprise crossing his face. Nobody in this house spoke to him so plainly anymore, not since the money had come, and turned every conversation careful and calculated. "Excuse me, I'm not trying to be rude," Nora said, though there was no real apology in her voice. "Just honest. My grandmother used to say a man who won't eat is usually a man carrying something heavier than hunger." For a long moment, Daniel simply stared at her, caught somewhere between annoyance and a strange, unfamiliar curiosity. Nobody had spoken to him with that kind of unguarded honesty in longer than he could remember. Most people who worked for him had learned quickly to weigh every word before it left their mouths, terrified of saying the wrong thing to the man who controlled their livelihoods. This woman, standing there with flour still dusted faintly on her apron, seemed entirely unconcerned with that particular fear. "You don't know the first thing about what I'm carrying," he said, quieter than he intended. Nora met his gaze steadily. "No, sir. I don't. But I know what an empty plate looks like on a man who's forgotten how to let anyone take care of him." She gestured toward the tray. "Try it. If you hate it, I'll take the tray back down myself and we'll never speak of it again." Something in her tone, some quiet, stubborn warmth beneath the bluntness, caught him off guard enough that he found himself almost against his own will picking up the fork. The first bite was simple. Eggs cooked soft, bacon crisp at the edges. Toast buttered generously, the way nobody in this house had bothered to make it in years. Every previous chef too focused on presentation, on delicate reductions and precise plating, to remember that sometimes the body did not want to be impressed. It only wanted to be fed. Daniel ate slowly, and Nora, sensing she had won some small, unspoken victory, said nothing more, simply turned to leave the room. "Wait," he said. She paused at the door, glancing back. "Where did you learn to cook like this, my grandmother?" Nora said, a faint, unguarded softness crossing her face for the first time since she'd arrived. "She always said fancy food fills a stomach. Food made with love fills something else." Daniel looked down at the half-eaten plate in front of him, something tightening quietly in his chest, and said nothing more, though his eyes followed her a moment longer than he meant them to as she disappeared through the doorway. That evening, Daniel found himself, for reasons he could not entirely explain, even to himself, requesting dinner be brought to his room rather than eaten alone in the vast, echoing dining hall downstairs. Peggy, informed of the request in the kitchen, allowed herself a small, private smile before instructing Nora to prepare the tray. "Me?" Nora asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Are you sure, Peggy? Wouldn't he rather have someone more experienced?" "He asked for you specifically," Peggy said simply. Though there was a knowing glint in her eyes, she did not bother to explain. Nora carried the tray upstairs with careful, measured steps, her heart beating a little faster than she cared to admit as she knocked on the heavy bedroom door. "Come in." The room, when she stepped inside, was exactly as overwhelming as she remembered: pale stone and soft golden light. More luxury in one space than her entire hometown likely possessed combined. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, a laptop open beside him, though his eyes lifted the moment she entered. "Your dinner, sir," Nora said, setting the tray down carefully. She should have left then. She very nearly did, turning toward the door, but something made her hesitate, glancing back at the vast empty room, at the man sitting so still and alone in the middle of all that gold and glass, and before she could stop herself, she found herself lowering into the chair near the window instead. Daniel looked up, one eyebrow raised slightly. "Something else you need?" "No, sir." Nora folded her hands in her lap, feeling suddenly a little foolish, though she did not rise to leave. "Just thought maybe you could use the company. Eating alone every night sounds lonely." He studied her for a long, silent moment, something guarded and uncertain moving behind his eyes, before, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close to one. "You always this direct with your employers, only the ones who look like they need it," Nora said. And then, before the silence could stretch too long or too awkward, she began to talk softly at first, and then with growing warmth, telling him about her hometown, about a neighbor's ornery goat that had once chased half the town square during a matter, wedding, about her grandmother's kitchen, and the particular way the whole house used to smell on Sunday mornings. Daniel ate slowly as she spoke, and though he said little in return, Nora noticed gradually the tension easing from his shoulders, the tired lines around his eyes softening by degrees, until somewhere in the middle of a story about the goat, finally cornering the town's mayor at his own daughter's reception, a short, surprised laugh escaped him, quiet and rusty, as though the sound itself had grown unfamiliar from disuse. Nora froze, delighted. "You laughed." "I did not," he said quickly, though the corner of his mouth had not fully recovered. "You absolutely did." She grinned, unable to help herself. "I heard it. Should I keep going?" He shook his head slightly, but there was no real refusal in the gesture, and so she continued story after story, warm and easy and unguarded, filling the vast cold room with something it had not held in longer than either of them cared to measure. Her voice began to slow, eventually her words growing softer, gentler, until somewhere in the middle of a half-finished sentence silence fell. Daniel looked up from his plate to find Nora asleep in the chair by the window, her head tilted gently to one side, her face peaceful in a way he had not seen since she'd arrived. All the day's careful guardedness melted away in a sleep. He sat very still for a long moment, simply looking at her, something unfamiliar and quiet stirring in his chest. Then, moving carefully so as not to wake her, he rose from the bed, retrieved a soft blanket from the nearby chair, and draped it gently over her shoulders, his hand lingering a moment longer than necessary against the fabric before he stepped back. He returned to his own bed, lay down in the dark, and closed his eyes, bracing himself out of long habit for the familiar hollow stretch of another sleepless night. Instead, for reasons he could not begin to explain, sleep came. Deep, heavy, dreamless sleep, the kind he had not known in 5 long years, settling over him like a gift he had long since stopped believing he deserved. Across the room, curled beneath the borrowed blanket, Nora slept on peacefully as well, entirely unaware of the quiet, extraordinary thing that had just happened. Unaware that somewhere in that vast gold-lit room something long broken in, a lonely, guarded man had just begun ever so slightly to Devon Sir Devon. Heel. Morning arrived softly through the tall windows, sunlight sliding across the pale stone floor like something poured rather than simply shining. Nora stirred, first blinking against the light, disoriented by the unfamiliar softness beneath her, and the strange borrowed blanket draped over her shoulders. For one long suspended moment she could not remember where she was. Then her eyes landed on the bed across the room and memory crashed back all at once. She sat bolt upright, heart hammering, staring at Daniel Sheehan asleep in his own bed, peaceful and still, his breathing slow and even in a way she had not seen from him even once during their brief acquaintance. Nora pressed a hand to her mouth, horrified. "Oh no," she whispered to herself. No. I fell asleep in his room. I am finished. I have been here 2 days, and I am already finished." She rose as quietly as she could manage, gathering her shoes in one hand, tiptoeing across the vast room with the exaggerated caution of a woman convinced the very floorboards might betray her. She reached the door, eased it open with agonizing slowness, and slipped out into the hallway, breaking into a near run the moment the door clicked shut behind her. She burst into the staff quarters breathless, and the 2 women already awake there startled upright at the sight of her. "Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" one of them asked. "I slept in his room," Nora gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. Silence fell over the room like a held breath. Then all at once the women were talking over each other, half scandalized, half delighted by the sheer scale of the scandal unfolding before breakfast had even been served. "You did what? Pack your things now before he even wakes up properly." "I didn't mean to," Nora said, dropping onto the edge of her own narrow bed, hands pressed over her face. "I was telling him a story, and then sleep just came like a thief in the night, and I never even felt it happening." "This girl is finished," one of them muttered, shaking her head, though there was something almost sympathetic beneath the teasing. Meanwhile, upstairs, Daniel Sheehan opened his eyes slowly to a morning that felt for the first time in longer than he could remember entirely unfamiliar. No fog behind his eyes, no dull ache pressing against his temples, no bone-deep exhaustion clinging to every limb. He blinked at the ceiling, momentarily confused by the strange foreign sensation of having actually rested. He sat up, glanced at the clock, and froze. He had slept straight through the night without once waking, without once checking the time in restless dread, without the familiar midnight hour arriving to snap his eyes open like clockwork. His gaze drifted to the empty chair by the window, the blanket folded neatly over its arm, and understanding settled over him, slowly, quietly, like the first light of dawn breaking over the desert. Nora. He found her in the kitchen an hour later, doing her best to appear entirely unremarkable, sliding a tray of biscuits into the oven, with far more focus than the task strictly required. She sensed him before she saw him, some instinct prickling at the back of her neck, and turned to find him standing in the doorway watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "Sir," she said, straightening quickly, wiping her hands on her apron. "I owe you an apology. What happened last night, falling asleep in your room like that, it was not appropriate and it will not happen again. I respect your space, your privacy, your Nora." She stopped. "Yes, sir." Daniel studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his tired but noticeably brighter eyes. "I slept through the whole night." Nora blinked. "Sir, last night, I didn't wake up once." He said it slowly, almost as if testing whether the words might dissolve if spoken too quickly. 5 years and I didn't wake up once." She did not know quite what to say to that, so she simply stood there waiting, watching him work through something clearly still settling into place behind his eyes. "From now on," he said finally, his voice steadying into something more familiar, more commanding, "you'll be serving all my meals. Breakfast, dinner. Personally." Silence dropped over the kitchen like a stone through still water. Behind Nora, Denise nearly dropped the pan she was holding. "Sir, are you certain?" Nora asked carefully. "I'm sure there are others far more qualified." "I'm certain," Daniel said, and something in his tone left no room for argument. He turned and left the kitchen without another word, leaving Nora standing frozen amid a room full of staring, stunned faces. The reaction spread through the household within the hour, moving from room to room the way gossip always did in a house full of people with very little to occupy their curiosity otherwise. By midday, it seemed every member of staff had heard some version of the story, each one more exaggerated than the last. Only her Denise said that afternoon, arms crossed tightly, addressing the small cluster of maids gathered near the laundry room. "After 2 days and she's already got exclusive rights to his dinner table. Maybe she used something on him," another muttered darkly. "Or maybe," said a younger woman near the back, a soft-spoken housemaid named Carrie. "He's just tired of eating alone. And she's the first person in this house who's ever bothered to sit with him instead of just serving him and leaving." The comment was met with dismissive scoffs, but Carrie only shrugged, unbothered, and returned to folding linens, unwilling to join the chorus of jealousy that had begun circling Nora since the moment word first spread. Nora, for her part, remained largely oblivious to the full extent of the whispering, too consumed by the sheer, surreal strangeness of her new circumstances to fully register the resentment building around her. She had come to this house desperate and exhausted, expecting nothing more than honest wages for honest labor, and had instead found herself within the span of 2 short days, standing at the center of a household drama she barely understood, the shape of Yet. That evening she carried his dinner tray upstairs, with hands that trembled only slightly, the ritual already beginning to feel less terrifying and strangely almost natural. She knocked, entered at his quiet response, and found him seated at the small table near the window rather than the bed, as though he had deliberately arranged a more proper setting for the occasion. "You didn't have to do this, sir," she said, setting down the tray. "The exclusive arrangement, I mean. I don't want the other staff thinking I've done something to earn special treatment. I haven't." "You slept in a room," Daniel said simply, "and for the first time in 5 years, so did I." "That's not nothing, Nora." She sat somewhat hesitantly in the chair across from him when he gestured toward it, still faintly disbelieving that a man of his stature would want her company at all, let alone request it directly. It could have been a coincidence. "It wasn't," he said, and there was a quiet certainty in his voice that left little room for further argument. They ate in comfortable, easing silence for a while, and then gradually Nora found herself talking again, softer, this time less performance and more genuine conversation, asking about the house, about Jimmy Conlon's guarded suspicion, day before about the strange, careful tension she had sensed, running beneath every corner of this beautiful, glittering estate. Daniel answered some questions, deflected others, but as the evening wore on, something between them settled into an easier rhythm, Less employer and employee, more. Two people simply sharing a meal, and slowly, cautiously, a little of teriyaki themselves. "Can I ask you something, sir?" Nora said, eventually setting down her fork. "You've asked me plenty already," he said, though there was no real edge to it. "Go ahead. Why haven't you eaten properly in so long? And don't tell me it's just the sleeping. I've watched you at this table 2 nights running now. You pick at food like it's something to survive rather than something to enjoy." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting toward the window, toward the darkening desert sky beyond the glass. "Food used to be something I fought for," he said, finally, his voice quieter than she had yet heard it. "Now it just reminds me of everything I have and everyone I don't." Nora did not push further, sensing the fragile edges of something she did not yet fully understand. But she reached across the table briefly and rested her hand over his, a small, simple gesture, warm and steady. "Well," she said softly, "for whatever it's worth, sir, you're not eating alone anymore. Not on my watch." Daniel looked down at her hand, then up at her face, something shifting quietly behind his tired eyes, guarded and uncertain but undeniably, unmistakably present. He did not pull away. Outside, the desert night settled fully over the estate stars emerging one by one above the glittering house. And inside that vast gold-lit room, two people who had each in their own separate ways forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen sat together in the quiet, beginning slowly and carefully to remember. Weeks passed, though nobody in the house could have said exactly how many, the days blurring together in the easy, unremarkable way that time does when something quietly good has begun to take root. What had started as a single, unexpected night of sleep became gradually a nightly ritual. Neither Daniel Sheehan nor Nora Quinn spoke about directly, though both understood without needing to say it aloud that something between them had shifted into new and unfamiliar territory. Dinner became the anchor of Daniel's day, in a way it had never been before. Meetings that once ran late into the evening now found reasons to end earlier. Phone calls grew shorter, more efficient, businesslike, in a way that left more than one confused associate wondering quietly what exactly had changed in the man who ran the Sheehan empire with such famously merciless focus. "You sound different, sir," one investor remarked cautiously over the phone one afternoon, the confusion evident in his voice. "Almost cheerful. Is that a problem?" Daniel asked, leaning back in his chair, a faint, unfamiliar warmth in his tone. "No, sir. No problem at all. Please continue." Daniel ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of his office, faintly amused by his own reflection in the darkened computer screen. He barely recognized the man looking back at him these days. The tired hollows beneath his eyes softened the perpetual tension in his shoulders, eased by something he still did not fully understand or trust himself to name. Nora, for her part, remained largely unaware of the full scope of the change she had brought into the house, too consumed by the daily rhythm of her new life to notice how thoroughly it had begun reshaping the man she served each evening. She spent her mornings in the kitchen, testing recipes from memory, simple things her grandmother had taught her. Cornbread and pot roast and apple pie with a crust she rolled by hand, and her evenings carrying trays upstairs, settling into the small chair by the window and talking, always talking, filling the vast, quiet room with warmth it had clearly gone without for a very long time. "Tonight's story is a good one," she announced one evening, setting down the tray with a flourish. "I practiced it in the kitchen earlier." Denise nearly dropped a whole tray of biscuits, laughing. Daniel looked up, one eyebrow raised, something close to genuine anticipation crossing his face. "You practiced it. I don't deliver low-quality stories, sir. I have standards." He almost smiled, settling back in his chair. "Proceed, then." And so she did, launching into a story about a neighbor back home who had once tried disastrously to impress a girl by borrowing his cousin's motorcycle, without knowing how to properly operate it, ending the tale with the poor man crashing directly into the church's prized flower display, 2 days before Easter Sunday. By the time she finished acting out the man's undignified sprawl among the crushed tulips with her whole body, Daniel was laughing outright, unguarded and full, a sound that had grown so foreign to this house that it seemed to echo strangely off the high ceilings. "Stop," he said, holding up a hand, still laughing. "That's enough. I can't take any more." Nora bowed dramatically. Thank you. Tickets are sold out for tomorrow's performance." He shook his head, smiling in a way that softened every hard line of his face. "You are something else, Nora Quinn." "I've been told," she said, settling back into her chair with obvious satisfaction. If you're watching this video and find it interesting and meaningful, don't forget to support our YouTube channel by subscribing or by liking and sharing this video with your friends so they can discover it too. Your support, even simply by subscribing to our channel, is a tremendous source of motivation and joy for our entire team. And now let's continue the story together. Not everyone in the house shared in the growing warmth. Jimmy Conlon had watched the change in his oldest friend with a wariness that deepened by the day, his instincts sharpened by years of protecting Daniel from threats both obvious and hidden, refusing to settle no matter how harmless this situation appeared on its surface. He found Daniel in the study late one evening going over quarterly reports that had notably been finished far earlier than usual, and closed the door quietly behind him before speaking. "We need to talk about the housekeeper," Jimmy said without preamble. Daniel did not look up from the papers. "Her name is Nora. I know her name." Jimmy crossed the room and dropped into the chair across the desk, his expression tight with barely restrained concern. "I also know she showed up out of nowhere 2 months ago, pregnant with no husband, no money, and no connections, and within a matter of weeks, she's got exclusive access to your meals, your evenings, and apparently your good mood. Doesn't that strike you as fast even for you? She's not after anything, Jimmy. Everybody's after something, Daniel. You taught me that yourself." Jimmy leaned forward, his voice lowering, more urgent now. "You remember the chefs. 99 of them, each one seemingly harmless, each one turning out to be exactly the kind of quiet threat we didn't see coming until it was too late. I'm not saying she's dangerous. I'm saying we don't know what she is yet. And that should worry you more than it seems to." Daniel finally set down his pen, meeting his old friend's gaze directly. "I've slept every single night since she arrived. Do you have any idea what that means to me?" "I do." Jimmy's voice softened slightly, the concern beneath his wariness plain now. "That's exactly why I'm worried. A man desperate enough for peace will hand over pieces of himself he can't afford to lose, and he won't even notice he's doing it until it's already gone." The words landed heavier than Jimmy perhaps intended, and for a long moment Daniel said nothing, staring down at the papers on his desk without really seeing them. "I trust her," he said finally, quietly. "You barely know her," Jimmy said, not unkindly but firmly. "I'm not telling you to throw her out. I'm telling you to be careful. That's all I've ever asked of you, and it's kept you alive this long." The tension did not disappear after that conversation. It simmered instead, quiet and persistent, coloring the edges of the household in ways both Daniel and Nora began gradually to notice. Jimmy took to observing Nora with a careful, unobtrusive attentiveness, watching how she moved through the house, who she spoke with, what questions she asked and did not ask. He was not cruel about it, not openly at least, but Nora felt the weight of his scrutiny nonetheless, a persistent, uncomfortable awareness that at least one person in this house remained thoroughly unconvinced of her intentions. She found him one afternoon in the hallway outside the kitchen, arms crossed, watching her carry a tray of fresh bread toward the pantry. "Something I can help you with?" she asked, setting the tray down, meeting his gaze directly rather than shrinking from it. "Just curious," Jimmy said, his tone deceptively casual. "What exactly does a girl from a small town in Ohio want with a man like Daniel Sheehan?" Nora's chin lifted slightly, old defenses rising by instinct. "A paycheck, Mr. Conlon. The same thing most people want from their employer." "Funny," Jimmy said. "Most people who just want a paycheck don't end up eating dinner alone with the boss every single night." "He asked me to," Nora said evenly. "I didn't demand a seat at his table. I was invited." Jimmy studied her for a long moment, something almost reluctantly respectful moving behind his sharp-guarded eyes. "Maybe so. But I've seen good people get used by bad situations before, and I've seen bad people wear good faces long enough to fool everyone around them. I don't know which one you are yet. I intend to find out." "Then find out," Nora said, holding his gaze, steadily refusing to back down. "I've got nothing to hide, Mr. Conlon. Look as closely as you like." She picked up her tray and walked past him, leaving Jimmy standing alone in the hallway, watching her go with an expression that had shifted subtly from open suspicion toward something more complicated, a grudging flicker of respect tangled uncomfortably alongside his continued wariness. That evening, as Nora carried Daniel's dinner tray upstairs, she found herself unusually quiet, Jimmy's words echoing uncomfortably in her mind. Daniel noticed immediately, his own instincts sharpened by weeks of watching her expressive face carefully. "Something's wrong," he said, not quite a question. Nora hesitated, then set down the tray and sat across from him, her earlier bravado faltering into something more honest. "Your friend Jimmy doesn't trust me." "Jimmy doesn't trust anyone," Daniel said, though there was a weariness in his voice that suggested the matter troubled him more than he wanted to admit. "It's kept me alive more times than I can count." "I understand why he's careful," Nora said slowly. "I do. But it's hard, sir, being looked at like I'm a threat when all I've ever wanted was a fair chance to work honestly and take care of my family." Her hand drifted briefly, unconsciously, to rest against the small curve of her stomach. "I know how this looks from the outside. Believe me, I know. But I'm not here to take anything from you that isn't freely given." Daniel watched her for a long, quiet moment, something protective and unfamiliar stirring behind his tired eyes. "Give him time," he said finally, softer now. "Jimmy's loyalty runs deep, and so does his caution. But so does his fairness once he's satisfied. He'll come around. And if he doesn't, Daniel reached across the table, an uncharacteristic gesture, and covered her hand with his own steady and warm. Then he answers to me. Nora looked down at his hand over hers, feeling something settle quietly in her chest. Gratitude and uncertainty tangled together in equal measure. Outside, the desert evening deepened into full darkness, stars scattering slowly across the wide Arizona sky. And inside that gold-lit room, two people continued carefully and quietly, drawing closer together, entirely unaware of how much further that closeness was about to be tested in the days still waiting ahead. The storm rolled in without warning, the way desert storms sometimes did, gathering swiftly over the mountains and breaking loose across Phoenix with a violence that rattled windows and turned the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Nora stood at the kitchen window that evening, watching lightning fracture the darkness in jagged white veins, and felt an odd unease settle over her that had nothing to do with the weather itself. She had noticed over the past weeks that certain nights affected Daniel differently than others. He grew quieter on evenings like this one, his eyes distant, even in the middle of conversation, his hands usually so steady, occasionally trembling slightly around the stem of his water glass. She had not asked him why. Some instinct old and careful had told her the answer belonged to him alone, to give whenever, if ever, he chose to. Tonight, however, dinner had been left largely untouched. Daniel had excused himself early, citing exhaustion, and retreated to his room while the storm outside continued building toward something fiercer. Nora cleaned the kitchen slowly, listening to the thunder roll closer, and told herself there was nothing unusual in a man wanting an early night during rough weather. She almost believed it until the scream reached her. It was not loud, not the way screams were in movies, but something rawer and more terrible for its restraint. A strangled, guttural sound of pure anguish carrying faintly down the hallway from Daniel's room. Nora dropped the dish towel she'd been holding and ran her bare feet slapping against cold marble, her heart hammering with a fear she could not fully name. She reached his door and did not bother knocking, pushing it open to find Daniel thrashing against his own sheets. Drenched in sweat, his face twisted in an expression of horror so complete it stole the breath from her lungs. His eyes were closed, still lost somewhere deep in whatever nightmare had claimed him, and words were tumbling from his lips, broken and desperate. "No, answer it. Please, just answer it, Frank. Frank, I'm sorry." Nora froze in the doorway, every muscle in her body locking still. Frank, her father's name. For one dizzying, disorienting moment, the room seemed to tilt around her, the storm outside and the anguish inside blurring together into something too large and strange to process. She told herself frantically that it was coincidence. A common enough name, nothing more, but even as the thought formed, some deeper, more instinctive part of her already understood that the universe rarely arranged such things by accident. "Daniel," she said, moving to the bedside, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "Daniel, wake up. You're dreaming." He gasped awake all at once, sitting bolt upright, chest heaving, eyes wide and unseeing for several long seconds before recognition slowly returned, and with it a wave of raw, unguarded shame that crossed his face before he could stop it. "Nora." His voice was hoarse, wrecked. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." She sat carefully on the edge of the bed, her own pulse still racing. "Daniel, who is Frank?" The question landed like a physical blow. Daniel's face went pale, all the color draining from it at once, and for a long moment he simply stared at her, something haunted and afraid moving behind his eyes. "Why do you ask?" he said, finally, very quietly. "Because you were calling his name, begging him to answer something." Nora's hands had begun to shake now, some deep primal instinct, screaming, warning through her chest. "Daniel, please. My father's name was Frank. Frank Quinn. He worked as a driver years ago before he—" Her voice broke. "Before he died in an accident, nobody in my family was ever given a proper explanation for. Please tell me that's a coincidence." The silence that followed felt endless, the storm outside crashing against the windows as though the sky itself understood the weight of what was about to be spoken. "It's not a coincidence," Daniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The room seemed to spin around her. Nora pressed a hand against the mattress to steady herself, her breath coming shallow and fast, disbelief and dawning horror tangling together in her chest, until she could barely tell where one ended and the other began. "Explain?" she managed. "Please, explain it to me right now." Daniel drew a long, unsteady breath, and for the first time since she had known him, Nora watched the careful, guarded control he wore like armor crumble away entirely, leaving behind something raw and young and utterly broken. "Your father worked for my family," he said slowly. "He was our driver for nearly 10 years. He drove my parents everywhere, took care of them, watched over them like they were his own family. He was kind and steady, and he never once made either of them feel like a burden even on the hardest days. Daniel's voice cracked. The night my parents died, there had been threats building for weeks that I hadn't fully understood, hadn't paid close enough attention to. Your father noticed things I missed. He called me that night, tried to warn me something was wrong. Nora's hands had begun trembling violently now, her whole body cold despite the warmth of the room. And I didn't answer. Daniel's voice broke completely. I was busy. I let it go to voicemail. By the time I understood what was happening, it was already too late. They were ambushed less than 2 miles from the restaurant where we'd all had dinner together that night. My parents died instantly. He closed his eyes, tears finally spilling free, the first Nora had ever seen from him. Your father threw himself between the gunman and the car. He died trying to protect people who weren't even his own family. And I have spent every single day since then living with the fact that if I had simply answered my phone, he might still be alive. Your father might still be alive, Nora, and you would still have him. Nora could not speak. The room tilted violently around her, again grief and shock, and a strange, terrible tenderness crashing together all at once, overwhelming, disorienting, impossible to fully absorb. She thought of every birthday her father had missed, every wedding, every ordinary Tuesday evening. He should have been alive to share with her family, and felt suddenly the full weight of a loss she had carried for years without ever knowing its true shape. He never told us the details, she whispered finally, her voice thick with tears. We were told it was an accident, a car accident. We buried him not knowing. She broke off, pressing both hands over her face, her shoulders shaking. He died protecting your parents. Yes. Daniel's voice was barely audible now, raw with a guilt he had carried alone for years. And I never had the courage to find your family to tell you what really happened, to properly thank the man who died, trying to save the people I loved most in this world. I told myself it would only cause more pain. The truth is, I was a coward. I couldn't face what my failure had cost your family. For a long moment, Nora simply sat there, tears streaming silently down her face, grief and anger, and a strange aching sympathy warring inside her chest all at once. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to demand to know why he had let her walk through his front door as a stranger, when their families had already been bound together by tragedy long before either of them had ever met. But looking at him now, broken open and trembling beside her, carrying a guilt so heavy, it had stolen his sleep for 5 long years, she found she could not summon the anger she thought she should feel. He believed in protecting people, Nora said, finally, softly wiping at her tears. That's who he was long before that night. He would have done exactly what he did, Daniel, whether it was your family or a stranger on the street. That was simply the kind of man he was. Daniel looked up at her, disbelief and fragile hope moving across his tear-streaked face. How can you say that so easily? I let him die. You didn't pull a trigger, Nora said firmly, though her voice trembled with the effort of speaking through her own grief. You made a mistake, a human mistake, one you have clearly punished yourself for every single day since. That's not the same as guilt, Daniel. That's grief wearing guilt's clothes. The storm outside had begun to soften, the thunder rolling further into the distance, rain settling into a gentler, steadier rhythm against the windows. Daniel reached out slowly, almost hesitantly, and Nora, after a long moment's hesitation of her own, allowed her hand to be taken, their fingers intertwining in the dim, storm-lit room. I don't know what this means, Daniel admitted quietly. That you're here. That out of everyone in this world, you're the one who walked through my door. Maybe it means something, Nora said softly, looking down at their joined hands. Something profound and unspoken settling over her chest alongside the grief. Maybe our families were never really strangers to begin with. Maybe some part of this was always going to happen. They sat together in silence as the storm finally passed, 2 people bound, now not merely by growing affection, but by a shared, tangled history. Neither had known they carried grief and guilt, and an unexpected, fragile tenderness weaving quietly between them in the fading dark. Neither spoke of what it might mean for what came next. Neither in that raw, exhausted moment needed to. Outside, the desert sky began to clear, stars emerging slowly behind the retreating clouds. And inside that quiet room, something long buried in both their hearts had finally painfully begun to surface into the light. A few weeks passed after the storm, and though neither Daniel nor Nora spoke often of what had been revealed that night, something between them had shifted permanently. Deeper now, quieter, bound together by grief they had not chosen but could. Nadunda. Daniel found himself watching her differently across the dinner table each evening, a tenderness in his gaze that no longer bothered hiding itself, and Nora in turn allowed herself cautiously to lean into the warmth growing steadily between them, even as the ache of her father's memory settled into a new permanent corner of her heart. It was during this fragile, tender season that the invitation arrived for the annual Sheehan Foundation Charity Gala, an event Daniel had attended alone reluctantly for each of the past 5 years, and had never once looked forward to. This year he found himself standing in his study, turning the embossed invitation over in his hands, thinking not of the tedious small talk or the careful business alliances the evening would require, but of someone else entirely. He found Nora in the kitchen that afternoon, elbow deep in flour, humming softly to herself as she rolled out dough for that evening's dinner. She looked up when he entered, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint smudge of flour across her cheek that he found absurdly rather endearing. "Sir," she said, straightening. "Something wrong. I need a favor," Daniel said, and something in his tone made her set down the rolling pin entirely, giving him her full attention. "There's a gala this weekend. Foundation event, formal, the kind of thing half the city turns out for." He paused, and for a man who commanded boardrooms with effortless authority, he suddenly looked almost nervous. "I'd like you to come with me." Nora blinked. "Me, sir, I'm your housekeeper, not exactly gala material." "You're exactly gala material," Daniel said quietly. "I'd simply like the company of someone who makes the evening bearable for once." She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of hesitation or doubt, and found none, only a steady, quiet sincerity that left little room to refuse. "All right," she said finally, a small, cautious smile tugging at her mouth. "But if I embarrass you in front of all your fancy friends, that's entirely on you for asking." "I'll take my chances," Daniel said, and for the first time, in longer than either of them could measure, he smiled fully, unguarded the expression, transforming his tired, guarded face into something almost boyish. The dress arrived 2 days later, delivered by courier in a garment bag. So elegant Nora was almost afraid to unzip it. Inside, she found a deep emerald gown, simple but beautifully cut, the kind of dress designed not to hide a woman's body but to honor it exactly as it was. She held it up against herself in the mirror of the staff quarters, tears unexpectedly stinging her eyes. Nobody had ever bought her something so carefully chosen, so clearly meant to make her feel beautiful rather than merely presentable. The evening of the gala arrived, and Nora stood in front of the mirror, as Carrie, the young housemaid who had quietly defended her weeks earlier, helped pin her hair into soft waves, both women silent, with the particular nervous energy of prey-splint, people preparing for something that mattered a great deal more than either wanted to admit aloud. "You look beautiful," Carrie said softly, stepping back to admire the finished result. Nora studied her own reflection, hardly recognizing the woman looking back at her, and felt a fragile, unfamiliar confidence settle over her shoulders like a second gown. Daniel was waiting in the entryway when she descended the staircase, dressed in a sharply tailored black suit, and the moment his eyes found her, something in his expression stilled entirely, as though the whole house around him had gone. "Quiet. You look," he said, searching for words that seemed to elude him, "extraordinary." "Just extraordinary," Nora teased, though her cheeks had flushed warm under his gaze. "I was hoping for at least dangerous." "That too," Daniel said, offering his arm, a genuine, unguarded smile lighting his face. "Definitely that too." The gala was held in a grand ballroom, downtown, chandeliers glittering above a sea of tailored suits and designer gowns, string quartet music drifting elegantly beneath the low murmur of practiced conversation. Nora felt every eye in the room turn toward them the moment they entered, whispers rising and falling like a tide she could not quite outrun. "Is that Daniel Sheehan's new housekeeper? Surely he's not serious about bringing her here. Poor thing. Doesn't she know how she looks next to everyone else in this room?" Nora kept her chin, lifted her hand steady on Daniel's arm, refusing to let the whispers show on her face, though each one landed somewhere deep in familiar echoes of every cruel word she had absorbed back home in Ohio. Daniel, sensing the tension in her posture, leaned close. "Let them talk," he murmured. "Their opinions change nothing about who you are before tonight, and they'll change nothing after." "Careful, sir," Nora said, forcing a small, brave smile. That almost sounded kind. "I have my moments," Daniel said, and guided her further into the room. It was near the center of the ballroom, beside a table draped in white linen, that Vivian Cross found them. She was, Nora had to admit, striking in the way expensive things are striking, tall and sharp. Featured her pale gold gown, catching the chandelier light with practiced precision. Her smile when she approached carried none of the warmth her eyes seemed determined to fake. "Daniel," Vivian said, her voice smooth as polished glass. "I'd heard rumors, but I confess I didn't quite believe them." "Vivian." Daniel's tone cooled, instantly protective and controlled. "Good evening." Vivian's gaze slid slowly, deliberately over Nora, lingering with obvious calculation on the soft curve of her stomach, the fullness of her frame, before returning unblinking to her face. And this must be the housekeeper everyone's talking about. Nora Quinn. Nora said evenly, extending her hand with a composure she did not entirely feel. It's lovely to meet you. Vivian did not take the offered hand. How resourceful of you finding your way into a house like this. Some women simply have a talent for landing softly regardless of circumstance. Her eyes flicked pointedly toward Nora's stomach. Though I imagine circumstances haven't been terribly kind to you lately. The words landed like a slap, sharp and deliberate, delivered with the particular cruelty of someone skilled in disguising insult as polite conversation. Nora felt heat rise in her cheeks, humiliation and fury tangling together. But before she could summon a response, Daniel stepped forward, his voice low and hard in a way Nora had never heard from him before. That's enough, Vivian. I'm simply making conversation, Daniel. Vivian's smile remained fixed, though something colder flickered behind her eyes now. Surely you understand my confusion. You who could have anyone in this city choosing someone so unconventional. I understand, Daniel said, stepping closer to Nora, his voice carrying now loud enough that several nearby guests turned to listen, that Nora Quinn has shown me more genuine kindness in a few short months than this entire room has managed in years. I understand that her worth has nothing to do with the shape of her body or the circumstances life has handed her, and everything to do with the strength of her character. If you can't understand that, Vivian, that's a limitation of your own, not hers. A ripple of surprised murmurs moved through the small cluster of onlookers. Vivian's carefully composed expression cracked just slightly before she recovered it with visible effort. How touching, she said, her voice tight now beneath its polish. Do enjoy your evening, then. She turned and swept away into the crowd, though not before casting one final calculating glance back over her shoulder. Something colder and more dangerous than mere jealousy, flickering briefly in her eyes. Nora stood very still for a long moment after Vivian's departure, her heart still hammering humiliation. Slowly giving way to something steadier. Something almost like gratitude. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. Yes, Daniel said, turning to face her fully, I did. His expression softened the hardness from moments before melting into something gentler, more open. Nora, I meant every word. You have shown me more kindness in these past few months than I have known in years. I won't stand by and let anyone in this room or anywhere else make you feel small for it. Nora felt tears threaten unexpectedly, and she blinked them back quickly, unwilling to let the evening's cruelty win even this small victory. Thank you, she said softly. Daniel offered his hand, and this time when the string quartet shifted into a slower, gentler song, he guided her onto the dance floor without hesitation, entirely unconcerned with the whispers still drifting through the room around them. They moved together slowly, imperfectly, Nora unfamiliar with the formal steps and Daniel patient in teaching her. And gradually, as the music swelled softly around them, the rest of the ballroom seemed to fade into background noise, leaving only the two of them turning slowly beneath the glittering chandeliers, closer now than either had quite intended to become. Neither noticed in that quiet, golden moment Vivian Cross watching them from across the room, her expression carefully blank, her mind already turning coldly toward thoughts far more dangerous than mere jealousy. The morning after the gala, word of the previous night's events had already spread through the household in the particular way scandal always did, growing more elaborate with each retelling. By the time Jimmy Conlon heard the story secondhand from one of the security staff, Daniel's public declaration in the ballroom had transformed in the telling into something closer to a proposal, and Jimmy's unease, already simmering for weeks, hardened into something far more urgent. He found Daniel in his study late that morning, going over the Foundation's quarterly reports with an ease and lightness that had become almost unrecognizable compared to the man Jimmy had known for the better part of a decade. You made quite a scene last night, Jimmy said, closing the door behind him without waiting to be invited in. Daniel did not look up from his papers. I said what needed saying. You said it in front of half the city's business elite, at an event where every word gets repeated and reshaped a dozen times before it reaches breakfast the next morning. Jimmy crossed the room and stood in front of the desk, arms folded, his expression tight with the particular frustration of a man who felt himself losing an argument he had not yet finished making. Daniel, I need you to hear me. Really hear me, not just wait politely until I stop talking. Something in Jimmy's tone made Daniel finally set down his pen. Go ahead. I've been asking around, Jimmy said, quietly. Nothing invasive, just a few calls to contacts back in Ohio, people who could tell me a little more about where Nora actually comes from. He paused, watching Daniel's face carefully. I found her father's name. Daniel's expression shifted, guarded, now careful. And Frank Quinn, Jimmy said. Died some years back. Worked as a private driver according to the records I found, though the details on who exactly he drove for are frustratingly thin. His eyes narrowed slightly. You already know this, don't you? I can see it on your face. Daniel exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand across his jaw, and for a long moment said nothing at all, the silence itself an answer. Daniel. Jimmy's voice sharpened alarm, creeping into it now. What aren't you telling me? Frank Quinn was our driver, Daniel said, finally quietly. Years ago, he was with my parents the night they died. He tried to warn me something was wrong, and I didn't answer the phone in time. Jimmy went very still, the weight of the revelation settling slowly over his face. And Nora is his daughter. Yes. For a long moment, Jimmy simply stared at him, working through the implications with the same careful, methodical instinct that had kept Daniel alive through years of dangerous business. You understand how this looks, he said finally, his voice low and urgent. A woman with a direct personal connection to the night your parents died shows up at your door out of the blue pregnant with nowhere else to go, and within weeks has become the only person you trust enough to let close. Daniel, that's not coincidence. That's not fate. That's the kind of setup I've spent years training myself to recognize. You think she planned this? Daniel said, an edge entering his own voice, now defensive in a way Jimmy had rarely heard from him. I think Jimmy said carefully that somebody wanting access to this family, wanting to exploit exactly the kind of guilt you've been carrying for 5 years, could not have designed a better approach if they'd tried. I think the timing is convenient in a way that makes my skin crawl. And I think you are so desperate for peace, so exhausted by 5 years of sleepless nights, that you're not asking the hard questions you would normally ask of anyone who walked into this house with a story that fits together this neatly. Daniel's jaw tightened. She didn't know who I was when she agreed to come here. Peggy can confirm that. She had no idea about the connection until the night she heard me say her father's name in my sleep. Or that's what she wants you to believe, Jimmy said. Daniel, I'm not saying she's definitely working against you. I'm saying we don't know enough yet to rule it out. And given everything this family has already survived, I am not willing to gamble your life on the assumption that grief and coincidence explain everything perfectly. The argument left both men shaken, and Jimmy left the study that morning with his resolve rather than softening, hardening into something more determined. He spent the following days pulling every thread he could find, contacting old associates, calling in favors from people who owed him discretion, piecing together whatever fragments of Nora's history he could locate. Much of what he found only deepened his unease rather than easing it. The abandoned wedding. The public humiliation at the altar. A hometown that seemed from every account he gathered to have turned entirely against her in the months before her departure. It read on paper like the profile of a woman with nothing left to lose, and everything to gain from exactly the kind of opportunity that had fallen into her lap. He found himself one evening standing outside the kitchen watching Nora move through her evening routine with the same warm, unguarded ease she always carried, humming softly as she plated Daniel's dinner, and felt a fresh wave of frustration at how easily her sincerity read as genuine even to his own trained, suspicious eye. You're staring again, Mr. Conlon, Nora said without turning around, evidently having sensed him standing there. Just thinking, Jimmy said. About whether I'm secretly plotting something. She turned to face him, then her expression more tired than angry, the weight of weeks of quiet scrutiny finally showing through. I know you don't trust me. I understand why, given everything this family has survived. But I promise you, Mr. Conlon, I did not walk through that door months ago with any plan beyond finding honest work and keeping my family fed. And the connection to Frank Quinn, Jimmy asked, watching her closely. That's quite a coincidence to have simply stumbled into. Nora's face paled slightly. You know about my father? I know he died protecting Daniel's parents. I know you had no idea of that connection when you arrived here. Jimmy's voice remained carefully even, testing. I also know that grief has a way of making people vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation I've spent years protecting this family against. Whether that manipulation comes from you directly or from someone using you without your full knowledge. Nora set down the plate she'd been holding, her hands trembling slightly. Is that what you think? That I'm being used somehow? Or worse, that I'm the one doing the using? I think Jimmy said slowly that I've watched good, well-meaning people get swept up in situations far bigger than they understood before. I'm not accusing you of malice, Nora. I'm telling you that I intend to keep watching carefully until I'm satisfied there's nothing dangerous hiding beneath the surface of all this. That's not cruelty. That's simply my job. Nora stood in the quiet kitchen long after Jimmy had left his words, settling uncomfortably into the same place her father's death had already carved open weeks earlier. She thought of Daniel's guilt of the storm night that had bound their families together in grief. Neither had chosen and felt for the first time since her arrival. A genuine flicker of fear, not for herself, but for what discovery of the full truth might yet unravel. She had not told Jimmy everything. She had not told anyone beyond Daniel himself the full depth of what she now understood about her father's death, about the questions that had never been properly answered, about the vague, troubling sense she had begun to carry that the ambush which killed both families' loved ones had not been the random act of violence everyone had always assumed. That evening, she carried Daniel's dinner tray upstairs in unusual silence, and he noticed immediately setting down his fork before she had even finished setting the table. "Jimmy spoke to you," he said. "It was not a question." "He's not wrong to be careful," Nora said quietly, sitting across from him. "I understand why he doesn't trust me yet. He'll come around," Daniel said, though there was less certainty in his voice than there had been weeks earlier. "And if he doesn't," Nora asked, "Daniel, what if there's more to this than either of us realizes? Yet, what if my father's warning that night wasn't about some random threat but something specific, something that never actually went away?" Daniel's expression sobered the same unease Jimmy had voiced earlier now, settling visibly over his own face. "What are you saying?" "I don't know yet," Nora admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "But your friend is asking questions I probably should have been asking myself weeks ago. What if the danger that took my father and your parents never really ended the night they died? What if it's still out there waiting?" Outside, the desert evening deepened into full darkness, and inside that gold-lit room both Daniel and Nora sat in troubled silence, the fragile peace they had built together over recent weeks suddenly unmistakably beginning to feel far more fragile than either had allowed themselves to believe. Jimmy Conlon did not sleep well in the days following his conversation with Nora in the kitchen. Her question lingered with him, uncomfortable and persistent, working its way beneath the careful, methodical part of his mind that had spent years protecting Daniel Sheehan from every conceivable threat. If the danger that had taken Frank Quinn and the elder Sheehans had never truly ended, then somewhere buried in old records and half-forgotten files, there had to be a thread he had missed. He began where he always began, in the archives, pulling old case files from the private security firm the family had used in the years immediately following the ambush, cross-referencing names, dates, business dealings that had seemed insignificant at the time, but might in hindsight tell a very different story. It was late one evening, the office lit only by the glow of his computer screen, when he found the first inconsistency. The official investigation into the ambush had concluded years ago that the attack had been a random act of violence, opportunistic and unconnected to any specific threat against the family. Jimmy had never fully believed that explanation, though he had lacked until now any concrete reason to challenge it. But buried in a set of financial records he had nearly overlooked, a pattern began to emerge, subtle but unmistakable once he knew where to look. In the months before the ambush, a substantial transfer of funds had passed through an account connected distantly but traceably to the Moretti family, a rival crime organization that had spent years attempting unsuccessfully to expand into territory the Sheehans controlled. The transfer had been small enough to escape immediate scrutiny, routed carefully through several shell companies before landing finally in an account Jimmy recognized with a jolt of cold, creeping dread. The account belonged to Vivian Cross. Jimmy sat back slowly in his chair, staring at the screen, his mind racing through implications too large and too terrible to fully absorb at once. He told himself at first that it had to be coincidence, some innocent business dealing that meant nothing sinister at all. But the more he dug, the more the pattern deepened. Additional transfers appearing over the following years, each one carefully timed, each one connected, however distantly, to moments of strategic advantage for the Moretti family's ongoing efforts against Sheehan interests. And then finally, buried deepest of all, he found the detail that turned his blood to ice. A payment dated mere days before the ambush that killed Daniel's parents, and Frank Quinn transferred from Vivian's account directly to a known associate of the Moretti organization, an amount precisely large enough to fund exactly the kind of operation that had unfolded on that rain-soaked night years ago. Jimmy sat frozen for a long time, the office silent around him, except for the distant hum of the estate's climate control system working through the full, devastating weight of what he had uncovered. Vivian Cross, the woman Daniel had once loved, had once nearly married, had funded the very ambush that killed his parents and shattered his life into the guarded, sleepless existence he had carried ever since. The motive, once Jimmy allowed himself to consider it, fully made a horrible kind of sense. Vivian had always wanted more than Daniel's affection. She had wanted his empire, his fortune, the kind of power that came only through absolute control, and with his parents alive and deeply involved in the company's governance, that control had remained perpetually out of reach. Their deaths had cleared the path directly toward Daniel himself, young, grieving, and in the years that followed, isolated enough by his own guilt and exhaustion to remain vulnerable to exactly the kind of patient, calculated manipulation Vivian had clearly been attempting for years. And now, with Nora threatening that same careful plan, drawing Daniel's affection away and more dangerously edging steadily closer to uncovering the truth about her own father's death, Vivian's motive for silence had only grown more urgent. Jimmy rose from his desk with sudden, sharp clarity, gathering the printed evidence with hands that trembled slightly despite years of practiced composure. He needed to reach Daniel immediately. He never made it to the study. Nora had spent that same evening in the estate's private library, quietly continuing her own search through old newspaper archives, chasing the same restless unease that had settled over her since her conversation with Jimmy days earlier. She had found little of substance, mostly old society pages and business announcements, until scrolling through a digitized archive of local newspapers, she came across a photograph that stopped her breath entirely. It was a charity function from years earlier, the caption identifying several attendees, including, unmistakably, a much younger Vivian Cross standing beside a man Nora recognized instantly from Jimmy's earlier description of Moretti, associates the two of them positioned with a familiarity that suggested far more than passing acquaintance. Nora stared at the image for a long moment, her mind working quickly through the implications, and had just reached for her phone to call Jimmy when the library door opened behind her. "Working late, I see." Nora turned startled to find Vivian Cross standing in the doorway, her expression pleasant, composed, utterly at odds with the cold calculation Nora now understood lived somewhere beneath that polished exterior. "Miss Cross," Nora said carefully, closing the laptop with what she hoped looked like casual disinterest. "I didn't realize you were still on the property. I had a few final matters to discuss with Daniel about the foundation," Vivian said smoothly, stepping further into the room. "But I couldn't help noticing you've been quite absorbed in your research this evening. Anything interesting?" Nora's heart pounded every instinct, screaming, warning, but she kept her voice level. "Just some old town history. Nothing important." Vivian's smile did not waver, though something colder flickered briefly behind her eyes. "You were always a poor liar, Nora. It's rather charming, actually, in its own way." She moved closer, her heels silent against the thick carpet. "I saw the screen before you closed it. That's an old photograph. Rather grainy. I'm surprised you'd find it worth your time. Should I not have?" Nora asked, rising slowly from her chair, positioning herself carefully between Vivian and the door. "That depends," Vivian said, her voice losing its polished warmth entirely now, "on how much you think you understand about what you've found." What followed happened quickly, disorienting in the way true danger often is, too fast and too strange for the mind to fully process in the moment it unfolds. Two men Nora did not recognize appeared in the doorway behind Vivian, their presence explaining with sudden, horrifying clarity why Vivian's confidence had never once faltered during their conversation. "I truly am sorry it's come to this," Vivian said. And for the first time, something almost like genuine regret flickered across her composed features, quickly smothered beneath cold necessity. "I've spent a great deal of time and effort protecting a secret I intend to keep protected, Nora, and you've gotten far too close for my comfort. Daniel will know," Nora said, her voice steadier than the panic flooding through her chest. "Jimmy already suspects something. You won't get away with this. Perhaps not forever," Vivian said, gesturing toward the two men who moved forward with quiet, practiced efficiency. "But long enough, I think, to finish what I started years ago. Your father should have minded his own business that night, Nora. It seems his daughter has inherited that same unfortunate habit." Nora's blood ran cold at the confirmation, but before she could respond, before she could even fully process the horror of what Vivian had just admitted, one of the men moved swiftly toward her, and the room dissolved into a chaotic blur of fear and resistance. Nora's cries cut short as she was forced from the library and out through a side entrance into the waiting darkness beyond. Jimmy reached Daniel's study minutes later, breathless, the printed evidence clutched tightly in his hand. "Daniel," he said urgently, pushing through the door without knocking, "it's Vivian. I found it. She's the one who funded the ambush that killed your parents. She's been working with the Morettis for years." And Nora, he stopped short at the sight of Daniel's face, already pale, already afraid, a phone clutched in his own trembling hand. "Nora's not answering," Daniel said, his voice hollow with dawning horror. "I called the library. Nobody's there." Jimmy, the security footage from the side entrance just went dark. The two men stared at each other for a single frozen moment, the full, terrible weight of the truth settling over them both at once before instinct and years of hardened partnership snapped instantly into motion. "We find her," Daniel said, already moving toward the door, his voice hard with a fury and terror unlike anything Jimmy had heard from him in all their years together. "Whatever it takes, Jimmy. We find her tonight. Outside, the desert night stretched dark and silent around the glittering estate, betraying nothing of the danger. Racing swiftly and visibly toward the woman who had, against every guarded instinct in Daniel Sheehan's carefully protected heart, finally taught him how to sleep again. The two men moved through the house like soldiers rather than businessmen, all pretense of civility stripped away in the urgency of the moment. Jimmy pulled up the estate's security footage on his phone as they ran, his trained eye scanning quickly past the darkened frames near the side entrance, until he found what he needed: a partial view of a black sedan pulling away from the property roughly 20 minutes earlier. Its license plate obscured, but its direction of travel clear enough to work with. East, Jimmy said, already moving toward the garage. Toward the old industrial district. There's a warehouse out there registered under one of the shell companies I found in Vivian's financial trail. If she's holding Nora anywhere close, that's where I'd start. Daniel said nothing, his jaw tight, his hands steady, despite the fear coursing through him, years of hardened discipline overriding the panic, threatening to consume him entirely. He had learned long ago that fear, however justified, accomplished nothing. Only action mattered now. They took the black sedan reserved for situations exactly like this, one engine roaring to life beneath Daniel's hands as he pulled out of the estate and onto the dark, empty highway stretching toward the edge of the city. Neither man spoke for several long minutes, the silence thick with a shared unspoken dread neither could afford to voice aloud. "She'll be all right," Jimmy said finally, though his voice carried little conviction. "Nora's stronger than most people give her credit for. She's carrying a child, Jimmy." Daniel's knuckles whitened against the steering wheel. "Whatever strength she has, it doesn't make her invincible." Nora, meanwhile, sat bound to a metal chair in the corner of a dimly lit warehouse office, her wrists chafing against rough rope, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The two men who had taken her stood near the door, silent and watchful, while Vivian paced slowly in front of her heels, clicking sharply against the concrete floor. "You should have left well enough alone," Vivian said, her earlier polish entirely gone, now replaced by something colder and more brittle. "I gave you every opportunity to simply enjoy your good fortune quietly. A warm bed, fine meals, a wealthy man's affection. That should have been enough for someone in your position. My father died protecting people he barely knew," Nora said, her voice trembling but steady, refusing to let fear fully claim her. "And you had him killed for money, for power. How do you live with that?" Vivian's expression flickered, something briefly uncertain passing behind her eyes before hardening again. "I live with it because I've spent years building toward something worth the cost. Daniel was always meant to be mine, long before his parents' outdated notions of business ethics stood in the way of what this family could truly become. I simply removed the obstacles." And Frank Quinn, Nora pressed, anger overtaking her fear now. "Was he just collateral damage to you? A man with a family, a daughter gone because he tried to warn people he cared about?" "An unfortunate necessity," Vivian said coldly. "One I've regretted in my own way, though not enough to have done things differently." Nora felt tears burn at the corners of her eyes, grief and fury tangling together, but she forced herself to meet Vivian's gaze, directly refusing to give the woman the satisfaction of watching her break. "Daniel will find you. Whatever happens to me tonight, he will find out the truth, and you will lose everything you've spent years building." Vivian's smile turned brittle. "Perhaps, but by then, my dear, it will already be far too late for you to see it happen." The warehouse came into view roughly 40 minutes later. A squat, unremarkable building on the edge of an industrial lot. Its windows dark except for a faint glow leaking from somewhere near the back offices. Daniel cut the headlights well before they reached the entrance, coasting the final stretch in near silence, years of hard-won instinct guiding his movements now with cold, focused precision. "Two vehicles out front," Jimmy murmured, scanning the lot through the windshield. "At least 2 men, probably more inside. We do this carefully, Daniel. Getting yourself killed doesn't save her." "I know," Daniel said, though the fury simmering beneath his calm exterior suggested restraint would not come easily tonight. They approached the building from the side, moving quickly and quietly along the shadowed perimeter, Jimmy's years of experience guiding them toward a rear entrance, rarely used and fortunately left unguarded. Inside, the warehouse stretched wide and dim, stacked crates casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The faint murmur of voices carrying from an office near the far wall. Daniel's heart clenched painfully at the sound of Nora's voice, strained but unmistakably alive, drifting faintly from behind the office door. "Stay close," Jimmy whispered. "We move on my signal." Inside the office, Vivian had grown visibly more agitated, checking her watch repeatedly, her earlier composure fraying at the edges as the minutes stretched longer than her plan apparently allowed for. "Where is your contact?" she snapped at one of the men near the door. "We should have heard from him by now." Before the man could answer, the lights in the outer warehouse flickered and died. Chaos erupted quickly after that, shouts and scrambling footsteps echoing through the darkened building, as Jimmy's carefully executed plan unfolded, exactly as intended, cutting the building's power to create confusion long enough for himself and Daniel to move through the darkness, unseen. Nora heard the commotion beyond the office door, her heart leaping with sudden desperate hope, even as Vivian's men moved quickly to secure the room, weapons drawn, tension crackling through the air. The office door burst open moments later, and Daniel stood in the doorway, his expression carved from cold, unyielding fury. Jimmy close behind him, both men moving with the swift, controlled precision of people who had faced danger before and refused to be undone by it now. "Let her go, Vivian," Daniel said, his voice low and dangerous, carrying none of the warmth Nora had grown accustomed to hearing from him. "This ends now." Vivian's eyes widened briefly with genuine surprise before her composure snapped back into place, cold and calculating even in the face of discovery. "Daniel, how resourceful of you." "I know everything," Daniel said, stepping further into the room, his eyes flicking briefly urgently to Nora before returning to Vivian with renewed controlled intensity. "The ambush. My parents. Frank Quinn. Every transfer, every payment, every year you spent pretending to grieve alongside me while quietly finishing what you started." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved, the standoff stretching taut and fragile in the dim, flickering light. Then quickly, before Vivian's remaining men could react, Jimmy moved with practiced speed, disarming the nearest guard, while Daniel crossed swiftly to Nora's side, his hands trembling as he worked at the ropes binding her wrists. "Daniel," Nora gasped, tears spilling freely now as the ropes finally gave way. "I'm all right. I'm all right, I promise." He pulled her carefully into his arms, his own composure finally cracking under the weight of relief flooding through him, holding her as though he might never let go again. Vivian, seeing her plan collapsing rapidly around her, made one final desperate attempt to flee toward the rear exit, only to find her path blocked by security personnel. Jimmy had quietly summoned the moment they'd left the estate men, who had been tracking their movements from a careful distance, the entire drive over. "It's finished," Vivian, Jimmy said, stepping forward as she was gently but firmly restrained. "Every transaction, every connection to the Moretti family, it's all documented. You won't be walking away from this one." Vivian's carefully maintained composure finally shattered, entirely years of calculated control dissolving into something raw and furious. "You have no idea what I sacrificed to build the life I nearly had." She spat, though her voice had lost all its earlier power. "Everything I did because Daniel was always meant to be mine." "No," Daniel said quietly, still holding Nora close, his voice carrying a calm, exhausted certainty that silenced the room entirely. "I was never meant to be yours, Vivian. I was simply someone you thought you could use the same way you used everyone else in your path. That ends tonight." The authorities arrived within the hour, taking Vivian and her remaining associates into custody, amid a flurry of urgent conversation and careful documentation, the full weight of years of hidden betrayal finally beginning its slow unraveling into daylight. Daniel remained close to Nora throughout, his arm steady around her shoulders, refusing to let more than a few inches separate them, even as investigators moved through the scene. "It's over," he murmured finally once the chaos had settled into something more manageable, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "It's finally over, Nora." She leaned into him, exhaustion and relief, washing over her in equal measure the terror of the past hours, slowly giving way to something gentler, steadier. "My father," she whispered, "he'd have wanted this. Not vengeance exactly, just the truth finally out in the open. He has it now," Daniel said softly, holding her tighter. "Both our families finally have it now." Outside, the desert sky had begun to lighten faintly at the edge's dawn, approaching slowly over the horizon, and as Daniel guided Nora gently toward the waiting car, Jimmy falling into step quietly beside them, something settled at last deep, and certain between all three of them, a fragile, hard one, peace finally beginning to take root, where years of guilt and grief and hidden danger had once held such stubborn, painful ground. The days following the warehouse rescue passed in a strange, suspended quiet, the household adjusting slowly to the aftermath of danger finally truly ended. Vivian Cross remained in custody, her connections to the Moretti family laid bare across a mounting stack of evidence Jimmy had spent years, without fully realizing it, quietly assembling. The estate itself seemed to exhale, its long corridors and guarded rooms settling into something lighter, as though the house itself had been holding its breath alongside its occupants, and could at last let it go. Nora slept for nearly 2 full days after the ordeal, her body finally surrendering to an exhaustion too deep to fight any longer, and Daniel rarely left her side, sitting quietly beside her bed through long stretches of afternoon light, watching over her the way she had once watched over him through countless sleepless nights of his own. When she finally woke, fully color returned to her face, and steadiness to her hands, she found him there, still dark circles beneath his eyes, his hand wrapped gently around hers. "You didn't have to stay," she murmured, voice rough with sleep. "Yes," Daniel said simply, "I did." It was on the third morning, as the desert sun rose pale and clean over the mountains, that Daniel asked her a question he had been turning over carefully in his mind since the night of the rescue. "There's somewhere I'd like to take you," he said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "If you're strong enough. It's somewhere I haven't visited in longer than I care to admit." Nora studied his face, seeing the careful vulnerability behind the request, and nodded without needing further explanation. "I think I already know where." The cemetery sat on a quiet hillside at the edge of the city, shaded by a scattering of old mesquite trees far removed from the glass and gold of the estate they had left behind that morning. Daniel led Nora slowly along a winding gravel path, his steps growing heavier the closer they came to a modest stretch of headstones near the hill's crest, until finally they stopped before two graves set side by side their side, inscriptions worn slightly by years of desert wind and sun. Robert Sheehan, Margaret Sheehan. Nora felt her breath catch grief, rising unexpectedly sharp and immediate, even for people she had never known in life. Understanding now in a way she had not fully understood before, the true weight of what Daniel had carried alone for so many years. "I used to come here every week," Daniel said quietly, his eyes fixed on the two headstones. "Then every month. Then, somewhere along the way, I stopped coming at all. I told myself I was too busy. The truth is, I couldn't stand to stand here and feel the weight of everything I hadn't managed to fix." Nora said nothing, simply stood beside him, her hand finding his steady and warm. "There's someone else I want to show you," Daniel said after a long moment, guiding her further along the path to a smaller, simpler headstone, set a short distance away, one Nora had not expected to find here at all. Frank Quinn. Nora's knees nearly gave out beneath her. She stared at the stone at her father's name, carved plainly into granite, in a place she had never known existed. A grief she had carried for years, suddenly given a physical location she had never once thought to look for. "You buried him here," she whispered, tears spilling freely now. "With your own parents." "I couldn't bear the thought of him resting anywhere else," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion of his own. "He died trying to save my family, Nora. It felt wrong, unbearably wrong, for him to be forgotten somewhere far away while my parents received every honor I could arrange. I paid for his stone myself. I visited in those early years more than I visited my own parents' graves, because some part of me needed to apologize to him more than I needed anything else in this world." "Why didn't you ever find us?" Nora asked, her voice breaking. "My mother, we searched for answers for years and never found any." Daniel closed his eyes, the guilt he had carried so long finally rising fully to the surface. "Because I was a coward, Nora. I told myself reaching out would only cause your family more pain, dredging up grief you'd already begun to move past. The truth is, I couldn't face you. I couldn't face the daughter of the man who died because of my failure. It was easier in my weakness to grieve alone than to risk seeing my guilt reflected back at me in your eyes." Nora knelt slowly before her father's grave, pressing her palm flat against the warm granite tears, streaming freely down her face, as years of unanswered questions finally settled into something resembling peace. She thought of her father's laugh, of his steady hands, of the quiet, unwavering kindness that had defined every memory she carried of him, and understood fully and completely now exactly the kind of man he had been. "He wouldn't want you carrying this alone," she said, finally, looking up at Daniel through her tears. "My father protected people because it was who he was, not because he expected anything in return, not even gratitude. He would never have wanted his death to become a weight you carried for the rest of your life. He'd have wanted you to live, Daniel. Really live." Daniel knelt beside her, his own composure, finally breaking entirely years of carefully guarded grief, spilling forth at last in the quiet shadow of the mesquite trees. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw, speaking directly to the headstone before them. "I'm sorry I didn't answer the phone. I'm sorry it took me so long to find the courage to bring your daughter here, to finally give her the truth she deserved from the very beginning. I'm sorry for every year I let my guilt keep me from honoring what you did for my family properly." Nora reached out and took his hand, holding it tightly as his shoulders shook with the release of years of buried sorrow. "He forgives you," she said softly. "I know he does. And so do I." They remained at the graves for a long while, the desert wind moving gently through the mesquite branches above them, carrying with it a quiet, unspoken sense of release neither had expected to find there. Daniel spoke eventually of small memories he had never shared with anyone: his mother's laughter, his father's steady patience, Frank's easy humor during long drives across the city, and Nora listened, weeping softly, adding her own memories in turn. Her father's habit of humming old songs while he worked his patient hands, teaching her to change a tire at the age of 12, his unwavering belief that kindness, however small, always mattered in the end. I think Nora said finally as the sun began climbing higher above the hillside that they'd be glad. Somehow, out of everything that happened, they'd be glad it led us here. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, something deep and unguarded moving behind his eyes, grief and gratitude, and a quiet growing love all tangled together in his gaze. I think so too, he said softly. They rose together, eventually brushing dust from their knees, and stood for one final moment before the three graves side by side, 3 lives bound together by tragedy, that had against every reasonable expectation ultimately led towards some healing rather than further ruin. Thank you, Daniel said quietly as they turned to walk back down the hillside path together, for giving me the courage to finally come back here, for giving me the courage to face what I'd been running from for 5 long years. Thank you, Nora said in return, her hand still held firmly in his, for finally giving my father the honor he deserved, for giving me the truth I spent years searching for and never expected to find. They walked the rest of the way down the quiet gravel path, in comfortable silence, the desert sun warm now against their shoulders, the weight both had carried alone for so long, finally, gently beginning to lift. Neither spoke yet of what waited ahead. The words neither had said aloud, though both now understood plainly lived. Somewhere between them, patient and certain, waiting only for the right quiet moment to finally be spoken. That moment, though neither knew it yet, was closer now than either had dared to hope. The weeks that followed the visit to the cemetery unfolded with a gentleness. The estate had rarely known the household settling into a rhythm that felt for the first time in longer than anyone could remember unburdened. Vivian Cross's trial proceedings moved steadily forward in the background. Her connection to the Moretti family and the ambush that had claimed 3 lives laid out in careful, damning detail. Though Daniel found himself increasingly less consumed by that unfolding justice and more consumed by the quiet, steady presence of the woman who had walked beside him through the worst of it, Jimmy Conlon had changed most visibly of all. The wary, guarded suspicion that had colored every interaction with Nora in those early months had dissolved, entirely replaced by something warmer, something closer to the fierce protective loyalty he had always reserved solely for Regin and Daniel. He found her one afternoon in the kitchen testing a new recipe, and leaned against the doorway with an easy smile that would have seemed impossible from him only months before. I owe you an apology, he said. A real one. I spent months treating you like a threat when you were the one person in this house brave enough to nearly die proving otherwise. Nora looked up, flour dusting her hands, a soft smile crossing her face. You were protecting him, Mr. Conlon. I never held that against you. Jimmy, he said. After everything, I think we're past Mr. Conlon. Jimmy, she agreed, and something settled easily into place between them. The last remaining wall of the household finally fully dismantled. Daniel found her that evening on the terrace overlooking the garden, the desert sky bruising slowly into shades of orange and violet as the sun began its long descent behind the mountains. She stood at the railing, one hand resting against the small, steadily growing curve of her stomach, watching the light change with the particular stillness of a woman lost in quiet thought. Penny for them, Daniel said, coming to stand beside her. Nora smiled faintly, not turning. Just thinking about how strange it is, how much can change in so short a time. Months ago, I was standing at an altar being told I wasn't worth marrying. Now I'm standing here in a place I never could have imagined, watching a sunset I don't think I've ever actually stopped to appreciate before. Daniel was quiet for a moment, studying her profile in the fading golden light, something steady and certain settling over his features. Nora, he said, finally, there's something I need to say to you, and I find myself, for possibly the first time in my adult life, entirely unsure how to say it properly. She turned to face him then, curiosity and something gentler flickering in her eyes. You've never struck me as a man who struggles with words, sir. I've never had to say anything that mattered this much before, Daniel admitted. And the honesty in his voice stripped away every last trace of the guarded, controlled man she had first met months earlier. I spent 5 years believing peace was something I had permanently lost, something no amount of money or power could ever buy back for me. Then you walked through that door, angry and exhausted and utterly unafraid of me, and somehow, without either of us understanding how, you gave me back the one thing I had stopped believing I would ever have again. Nora's breath caught tears already threatening at the corners of her eyes. I think about you constantly, Daniel continued, his voice growing softer, more unguarded with every word. I wait for you at dinner every evening the way I used to wait for sleep, desperate and uncertain whether it would actually come. You've seen the worst of what I carry, the guilt, the grief, the anger I've spent years hiding from everyone, including myself, and instead of running from it, you knelt beside me at my parents' graves and helped me finally set it down. He reached for her hand, holding it carefully, reverently between both of his own. I love you, Nora. Not because of what you've done for me, though God knows that alone would be reason enough, but because of who you are. Your strength, your honesty, your refusal to let this world convince you that you're anything less than extraordinary. Nora stood frozen for a long moment, the weight of his words settling slowly, disorienting and overwhelming in equal measure. She had spent months bracing herself against precisely this kind of vulnerability. Terrified of hoping for something she had once believed entirely lost to her the day Wade Colton had humiliated her in front of an entire town. Daniel, she said finally, her voice trembling, you understand what you're saying. You're a billionaire. I'm a housekeeper who arrived here pregnant and penniless, with nothing to offer beyond honest work and an inability to keep my mouth shut. I understand exactly what I'm saying, Daniel said steadily. The world will have opinions, Nora warned, though her voice had softened considerably, hope beginning to override her carefully maintained caution. They already do. Vivian was only the beginning. Let them, Daniel said simply. I built an empire from nothing, Nora. I know precisely what the world's opinions are worth when weighed against something real. He stepped closer, his hand rising gently to cup her face. I'm not asking you because it's convenient, or because I'm grateful, or because circumstance has thrown us together. I'm asking because for the first time in longer than I can remember, I know exactly what I want, and it's you, every version of you. The one who challenged me in my study the day we met, the one who fell asleep telling me stories about goats, the one who knelt at my parents' graves and taught me how to grieve properly. All of it. I love all of it. Tears spilled freely down Nora's face now, and she let out a small disbelieving laugh through them. This is serious. You're absolutely certain? I have never been more certain of anything in my life, Daniel said, and the steady conviction in his voice left no room left for doubt. Nora looked at him for a long, searching moment, seeing not the billionaire, not the guarded mafia boss the world feared, but simply a man wounded and healing, and utterly sincere, standing before her with his heart laid entirely bare. I love you too, she whispered finally. I think I have for longer than I let myself admit. Daniel's public declaration came only days later, and it came characteristically without warning or ceremony. He gathered the household staff in the great hall one evening, the same room where whispers about Nora had first taken root months earlier, and stood before them with Nora's hand held firmly in his own. I want to make something clear, he said, his voice carrying easily across the gathered room, steady and unyielding. Nora is not simply a member of this household staff. She has not been for some time. She is the woman I love, the woman who saved my life in more ways than any of you fully understand, and she will soon be my wife. Murmurs rippled through the assembled staff, surprise, and for many genuine delight, the earlier resentment that had once colored their treatment of Nora having long since softened into something closer to admiration. I know some of you had doubts early on. Daniel continued, his gaze sweeping the room with quiet authority. I understand why. This house has learned painfully to be careful of strangers. But Nora Quinn has proven beyond any reasonable doubt exactly what kind of heart she carries. Her worth was never measured by her circumstances when she arrived here, and I won't have anyone in this household ever suggest otherwise again. Denise, who had once been among the sharpest-tongued critics during Nora's first difficult days, stepped forward from the crowd, her expression sincere. For what it's worth, sir, I think we all see it now, too. Nora, overwhelmed, could only manage a watery, grateful smile, Daniel's hand tightening reassuringly around her own. That evening, standing together on the terrace once more, as the last light faded fully from the desert sky, Nora rested her head against Daniel's shoulder, feeling for the first time in longer than she could remember entirely and completely at peace. Will there be food at the wedding? She asked, suddenly breaking the comfortable silence. Daniel laughed, the sound warm and unguarded, filling the quiet evening air. Of course there will be food, good Nora said, smiling against his shoulder. Because I cannot properly commit to any major life event without it. He pulled her closer, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head, and together they stood watching the stars emerge slowly over the mountains. Two people who had each in their own way finally found their way home. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and golden, the kind of desert morning that seemed deliberately to have set aside every storm cloud in favor of unclouded light. The estate had transformed overnight. The sprawling garden behind the main house, draped in soft white fabric and strings of warm lantern light, rows of simple wooden chairs arranged beneath the wide Arizona sky rather than within any grand ballroom Daniel might once have chosen in an earlier version of himself. It had been Nora's request, offered gently but firmly weeks earlier. Somewhere simple, she had told him. Somewhere that feels like us, not like the world watching us. Daniel had agreed without hesitation. And so the garden had become the setting close to the small stone bench he had commissioned quietly in recent weeks, tucked beneath the shade of an old mesquite tree near the edge of the property. 3 names were engraved upon it side by side: Robert Sheehan, Margaret Sheehan, Frank Quinn. Not a grave, but a place of remembrance. Closer to home, somewhere Daniel could sit in the years ahead and speak to the 3 people whose sacrifice had, in ways none of them could have foreseen, ultimately led toward this very morning. Nora stood in the room that had once been reserved for guests of far greater station than a former housekeeper, now serving as her own private space, to prepare Carrie and Peggy, fussing gently over the final details of her gown, a soft ivory dress that flowed simply over the growing curve of her stomach, elegant, without pretense, honoring rather than hiding the life she carried within her. Peggy, who had first carried Nora through those estate gates months earlier as little more than a desperate stranger seeking honest work, now stood back to admire the finished result, with tears openly gathering in her eyes. "Look at you," Peggy murmured, voice thick with emotion. "I knew the very first moment I met you in your mother's kitchen that you were going to change something in this world. I just never imagined it would be quite this much. You changed everything," Peggy, Nora said, softly reaching to take the older woman's hands. "None of this happens without you walking into my mother's house that day." "Nonsense," Peggy said, though her voice wavered with pride. "I only opened a door, dear. You're the one who had the courage to walk through it." Outside, beneath the mesquite tree, Daniel stood beside Jimmy, adjusting his cufflinks with hands that trembled slightly. An unfamiliar nervousness settling over a man who had faced down rival crime families and hostile boardrooms without ever once losing his composure. "Never thought I'd see the day," Jimmy said, a warm, genuine smile breaking across his usually guarded features. Daniel Sheehan, nervous. "I've negotiated deals worth more money than most people see in a lifetime," Daniel admitted, exhaling slowly. "Never once felt like this. That's because none of those deals actually mattered," Jimmy said, clapping a steady hand on his old friend's shoulder. "This one does." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "I owe you an apology too, you know. I spent months trying to protect you from the one person who was actually going to save you. You were protecting me the only way you knew how," Daniel said. "That's never something I'll hold against you, Jimmy. If anything, your caution is exactly what helped us finally catch Vivian before she could do any further damage. We make a good team. Always have." Jimmy nodded, clearing his throat against sudden emotion of his own. "Best man duties," he said, straightening Daniel's collar with brisk efficiency, "include making sure you don't fall apart before she even walks down that aisle." The small gathering rose as the string quartet, tucked discreetly beneath the garden's largest tree, began the opening notes of the processional. Nora appeared at the far end of the garden path, and Daniel felt every carefully guarded wall he had built over the past 5 years finally completely fall away at the sight of her. She walked slowly, deliberately, her hand resting lightly against her stomach, her face radiant beneath the soft desert sun, and Daniel found himself, for possibly the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely undone by simple, uncomplicated happiness. She reached him at last, and he took her hands in his voice already thick with emotion before the ceremony had even properly begun. "You look," he said softly, echoing words spoken months earlier, in a different, more guarded lifetime. "Extraordinary. Just extraordinary," Nora whispered back, tears already gathering in her own eyes. "Everything Daniel said. You look like everything I never let myself hope for." The ceremony itself was brief, simple, entirely unconcerned with grandeur. When the officiant finally reached the exchange of vows, Daniel spoke first, his voice carrying clearly across the small, hushed gathering. "I spent 5 years of my life unable to find peace," he said, his eyes never leaving Nora's face. "I told myself that was simply the price of the life I had built, the cost of power and wealth and everything I had fought so hard to protect. I was wrong. Peace was never something I could buy or build or fight my way toward. It was something I had to be given freely by someone brave enough to see past every wall I had built, and love what remained underneath anyway." His voice broke slightly, and he steadied himself before continuing. "Nora, you gave me back my life. Not just my sleep, though God knows that alone would have been a miracle. You gave me back my capacity to trust, to grieve properly, to hope for something beyond mere survival. I promise to spend the rest of my life earning that gift every single day for as long as you'll have me." Nora, tears streaming freely now, took a steadying breath before offering her own vow. "I came to this house with nothing left to lose," she said. "I'd been told by people who should have loved me that I wasn't worth choosing, wasn't worth fighting for. You taught me otherwise, Daniel, not through grand gestures, but through the simple, steady act of choosing me over and over, even when the whole world seemed determined to convince you otherwise." Her voice softened further, trembling with emotion. "My father died protecting the people he loved. I like to think somewhere he's watching now, glad that his sacrifice ultimately led toward this moment, toward healing rather than more grief. I promise to love you. The way he taught me love should look steady, selfless, and utterly without condition. When the officiant finally pronounced them married, the small gathering rose in warm, genuine applause, and Daniel pulled Nora into his arms, kissing her gently, as the desert wind stirred softly through the mesquite branches above the memorial bench nearby, as though carrying with it some quiet blessing from those who could no longer stand among the living to witness the moment themselves. That evening, long after the celebration had wound down and the last guests had departed, Daniel and Nora returned to the same gold-lit bedroom where everything between them had first quietly begun. Nora settled onto the bed with a contented sigh, pressing a hand gently against her stomach, feeling the small, steady movements of the life growing within her. "My new office," she declared, echoing an old joke with a soft, tired smile. Daniel laughed, lying down beside her, gathering her carefully into his arms. "Comfortable, Mrs. Sheehan, getting there," Nora murmured already, growing drowsy against his shoulder. Daniel lay quietly for a long moment, watching her drift toward sleep, feeling his own eyes grow heavy in turn, not from exhaustion born of guilt or grief, but from something far gentler, far more complete. He closed his eyes, and sleep came easily, deeply, the way it had come to him every night, since the woman now resting peacefully beside him had first walked unafraid and unbroken through his front door. In the months and years that followed, the Sheehan estate became known throughout Phoenix, not merely for its wealth, but for something far rarer, genuine warmth. Jimmy remained Daniel's closest confidant, though his guarded wariness had softened permanently into something gentler, more trusting, having learned firsthand the danger of assuming the worst of good people simply because the world had taught him caution. Peggy continued to watch over the household with the same fierce, maternal devotion she always had now, with the added joy of watching two people she loved build a life together neither had believed possible for themselves. And Daniel Sheehan, once a man who had spent 5 long years searching desperately for peace in every corner of his considerable fortune, learned finally that true healing had never been something money could purchase. It had been waiting all along in the courage of a woman who refused to let the world's cruelty define her worth, in the quiet, patient work of forgiving himself for a mistake made in a single unguarded moment years earlier, and in the simple, profound truth that love, real love chosen deliberately and protected fiercely, could heal wounds that no doctor, no medicine, and no amount of power ever could. Some things, it turned out, were never meant to be bought. They were only ever meant to be found in the most unexpected of places by hearts brave enough to keep searching. If this story moved you, consider sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that healing is always possible, and that love chosen with courage can mend even the deepest wounds. Thank you for watching.